Hi friends. If you're enjoying my videos, please hit the like button. It helps the YouTube algorithm notice me. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Growing up, my twin sister Sasha and I always knew there was something different about the old house we lived in with our parents in rural Michigan. Built in the late 1800s, the rickety two-story farmhouse had a long history, much of it tragic and shrouded in dark secrets. Our parents, desperate for affordable housing when they were newlyweds, had gotten it for a steal at a foreclosure auction in the early 90s, unaware of the property's notorious past. From an early age, Sasha and I were keenly attuned to the otherworldly presences that seemed to linger in the dim, musty rooms and lurk in the shadowy corners. We'd often wake in the middle of the night to the sound of creaking floorboards and slamming doors, even when we were the only ones awake. Disembodied whispers echoed down the hallways. Icy tendrils of air raised goosebumps on our flesh for no reason. While unsettling, these strange disturbances became a normal part of our childhood, eerie but ultimately harmless quirks of our very old, very haunted home. But things changed when Sasha turned 11. She came downstairs one morning, dark circles under her eyes, face drawn and ashen, and announced in a trembling voice that she had seen a ghost in her bedroom the previous night. Not a fleeting, shadowy specter like the ones we were accustomed to, but a fully manifested spirit, a distraught middle-aged man in tattered clothing who had stood at the foot of her bed, wailing and gesticulating frantically as if pleading for help. He kept saying the same thing over and over, my boy, where is my boy?" Sasha recounted, her voice quavering. I couldn't understand most of what he was saying because it wasn't in English, but he looked so desperate, so tormented. It was awful. She shuddered, rubbing her arms as if to ward off a sudden chill. It was only the beginning. From that night on, Sasha was plagued by visits from all manner of distressed, earthbound spirits seeking some kind of aid or resolution that she was powerless to give. Some were frightening, their faces contorted in rage or anguish, their garments rotted with age and streaked with old bloodstains. Others were merely pitiable, forlorn shades adrift in a purgatory of endless sorrow, unable to find peace. Whenever the ghostly visitations became too intense, our parents would burn sage and perform cleansing rituals handed down from the native Ojibwe people who had once inhabited the land our house was built on. The rituals seemed to help for a while, forcing the spirits into a temporary quiescence, but sooner or later they always came back, drawn to Sasha like moths to a flame. It was as if they sensed something in her, some deep well of compassion and sensitivity, and were desperate to make a connection with the living world they had left behind. Still, despite the undeniable reality of what was happening to her, Sasha never let fear rule her life. With admirable bravery and resilience, she came to accept her role as an unwitting bridge between the realms of the living and the dead. Her gentle heart ached for the lost souls that sought her out, and she did her best to provide them solace, even if she couldn't truly help them resolve their unfinished business. I was very protective of my sister. Her nighttime ordeals left her fatigued and nervy, and I took to sleeping on the floor of her bedroom some nights, a silent guardian against the whims of capricious spirits. But while I could offer comfort and companionship, I knew I was ultimately powerless to shield her from the inexplicable burden that fate had seen fit to place on her slender shoulders. All I could do was remain at her side, a steadfast ally on her journey into the haunted unknown. Our otherworldly companions followed us into adolescence and beyond, a constant reminder that our house was a thin place, where the veil between worlds frayed and sometimes fell away completely. Apparitions wandering the upstairs hallway, phantom footsteps trailing up the attic stairs, the tinkling of ghostly music boxes from empty rooms. These uncanny occurrences wove themselves into the fabric of our lives, bizarre but no longer especially remarkable to us. We learned to live with the various shades and specters, to acknowledge their presence without letting ourselves be overwhelmed by the strangeness of it all. They were an integral part of the only home we had ever known, as much a fixture of our family history as the antique furniture and faded photographs passed down through generations. But nothing could have prepared us for the full extent of the nightmarish evil that had lain dormant in the old house for untold decades. An ancient malevolence patiently biding its time until the perfect vessel came along. A darkness that would soon reveal itself to Sasha in the most horrific way imaginable, and change our lives forever. I'll never forget that cold, moonless night in late January when the crawling man first appeared. I was 17 at the time, my sister and I mere months away from graduating high school and venturing out into the world as legal adults. Little did we know that the terrifying events to come would make our imminent adulthood seem like the least of our worries. It started out as an evening like any other. Our parents were away for the weekend, trusting us to look after ourselves and the house for a couple of days. After dinner, Sasha and I settled into our usual nighttime routines. She curled up in bed with a book while I stayed up late at my desk, working on some drawings for my art class. Our dog Molly, a gentle blue-nosed pit bull, snoozed at my feet, her soft snores a comforting backdrop to the scratch of pencil on paper. Around midnight, I glanced at the clock and stretched, yawning hugely. I still had a few more sketches to finish, but my eyes were starting to droop. I was just about to get up and brew a cup of coffee to power through the rest of my homework when my phone chimed with an incoming text. It was from Sasha. Frowning, I tapped the notification and read her message. "Devin, please come here. Now. There's something in my room." A tendril of unease wormed through my gut. Sasha's room had always been a hot spot for paranormal activity, but it had been months since she'd had a really bad encounter. We'd started to hope that maybe the ghosts were finally losing interest in her. I texted back, "On my way." Trying to shake off my sense of foreboding, I hurried down the hall to my sister's bedroom, Molly padding along at my heels. The door was closed, which was strange. Sasha usually kept it open a crack when she was reading. I eased it open and peered into the dimness. "Sash, you okay?" A choked sob answered me. Heart pounding, I fumbled for the light switch and flipped it on. Sasha was sitting up in bed, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her face was ghost white, her eyes huge and haunted in their sockets. She was shaking uncontrollably, like she was in shock. "Sasha!" I crossed to the bed in 2 strides and sat down beside her, pulling her into my arms. She collapsed against me, burying her face in my shoulder. Molly whined and pawed at the bed, distressed by Sasha's obvious terror. "What happened? What did you see?" It took a few moments for my sister to compose herself enough to speak. Her breath came in shallow, panicky gasps, and I could feel her heart slamming against her ribcage. "There was a man," she managed finally, her voice muffled by my shirt. "A man, crawling on the floor." An icy chill crept up my spine. We'd seen a lot of strange and unsettling things in this house, but never anything like that. "What do you mean, crawling? Like, on his hands and knees?" Sasha shook her head jerkily. "No, more like a crab. Or a spider." A violent shudder racked her slender frame. It came skittering down the hallway, moving so fast, so unnaturally. It crawled right up to my doorway and just crouched there, staring at me. I held her tighter, my mind reeling as I tried to visualize the horrifying thing she was describing. A human body contorted into an arachnid crawl, scrabbling across the floor with preternatural speed and agility. The thought alone was enough to make my skin crawl. "Did you see its face?" I asked, not really sure I wanted to know the answer. Another shudder. Not really. It was dark and it moved so quickly, but I got the impression of a man with something very wrong with him. Her voice dropped to a haunted whisper. Something twisted. Something evil. A leaden dread settled in the pit of my stomach. In all our years of living with restless spirits, we had never encountered anything that felt truly malevolent. Unsettling, yes. Sorrowful, often. but nothing that radiated the kind of sinister intent Sasha was describing. Did it try to come into your room? I asked, still struggling to wrap my mind around the enormity of what she'd just experienced. Sasha swallowed hard, shaking her head. No, it just crouched there in the doorway watching me. For how long, I don't know. It felt like an eternity, but it could have only been a few seconds. And then, she trailed off, her breath hitching. And then what? I pressed gently, steeling myself for her response. And then it looked right at me, directly into my eyes, and it smiled. Sasha's voice cracked on the last word, and a single tear slid down her ashen cheek. I shivered. The thought of that grotesque thing grinning at my sister from the shadows filled me with a deeper revulsion than anything I'd ever known. What happened next? I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. It scuttled away, back down the hall the same way it came. I heard it crawling, skittering over the floorboards until the sound just faded away. Sasha drew in a shaky breath, visibly struggling to compose herself. And then I texted you. For a long moment, we just sat there clinging to each other, trying to process the sheer alien wrongness of what Sasha had seen. Molly whimpered softly and laid her big square head on the bed, her soulful eyes radiating concern. The familiar weight and warmth of her presence was a small comfort in the face of such unthinkable horror. Finally, I gave my sister a gentle squeeze and eased myself off the bed. I'm going to do a quick sweep of the house, make sure all the doors and windows are locked. Will you be okay here for a minute? Sasha nodded, looking slightly less shell-shocked now. I think so. Molly will stay with me, won't you, girl? Our loyal pup thumped her tail in agreement, and Sasha managed a weak but grateful smile. After triple-checking every lock in the house, I returned to my sister's room with a steaming mug of chamomile tea, hoping it would soothe her rattled nerves. She accepted it with shaking hands, sipping carefully at the hot, fragrant brew. Over the rim of the mug, her eyes met mine, swirling with a mixture of fear, confusion, and grim resignation. Devin, what are we going to do? She asked softly. This thing, it's not like the others. It feels dangerous. Her question hung heavy in the air between us. I wanted so badly to reassure her, to tell her that we would figure this out like we always did, that there was nothing to be truly afraid of. But the words stuck in my throat. Because deep down, in a place beyond reason or logic, I knew she was right. The crawling man was something different, something darker and more insidious than anything we'd ever faced before. And that terrified me right down to my core. That first encounter with the crawling man was only the beginning. As the days crept by and turned into weeks, Sasha fell into a state of constant, gnawing dread, jumping at every unexpected sound, whipping her head around at the slightest flicker of movement in her peripheral vision. She knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that the horribly twisted thing would be back. It was just a matter of time. Our parents started to notice the toll the stress was taking on my sister. The shadows under her eyes grew deeper and more pronounced with each passing day, and she picked at her meals like a bird, her appetite eroded by anxiety. When they asked what was troubling her, she mumbled something about school and graduation pressure, knowing full well they wouldn't believe the awful truth. There are some things that the human mind simply refuses to acknowledge, no matter how much evidence is presented. Our parents loved us deeply, but they had never been able to fully accept the existence of the uncanny forces that swirled around us. I was consumed with worry for my twin, the other half of my soul. Her experience had shaken me badly, but at least I had been spared the full terror of seeing that ghastly figure with my own eyes. I couldn't imagine how much worse it must have been for Sasha to have that nightmarish image seared indelibly into her memory. I took to sleeping on her bedroom floor again, like I had when we were kids and the ghostly activity was at its peak. Molly joined me, her sturdy warmth pressed against my side. a silent guardian against the malevolent forces that threatened our family's peace of mind. We both knew it was a purely symbolic gesture. If the crawling man returned, there would be little either of us could do to stop it. But it brought Sasha a modicum of comfort, and that was reason enough for me. As the month wore on with no further sign of the entity, we started to breathe a little easier, hoping against hope that maybe, just maybe, it had been a one-time manifestation, a random blip in the fabric of reality that wouldn't repeat itself. But that fragile optimism was shattered on a cold, gusty night in early March, when the crawling man returned with a vengeance. It was close to 3:00 a.m., the hour of the wolf, when I was startled out of a restless slumber by the sound of Molly growling, low and menacing in the darkness. Disoriented, I sat up quickly, blinking the sleep from my eyes. My neck was stiff from my awkward position on the floor, and it took me a moment to remember where I was. And then I saw it. A shadow darker than the surrounding gloom crouched in the doorway to Sasha's room, unnaturally still and silent. For a single frozen heartbeat, I thought I must still be dreaming, that the sinister figure was nothing more than a lingering specter of my troubled subconscious. But then Molly lunged forward, her lips curled back in a snarl, and the thing jerked into sudden, horrifying motion. It scuttled into the room with a speed that defied belief, its limbs bent at bizarre angles, its movements sharp and erratic like a marionette being yanked by a madman's strings. I scrambled backward with a strangled cry, instinctively putting myself between the nightmarish intruder and my sister's bed. Sasha bolted upright with a shriek, clutching her blankets to her chest, her eyes wide with terror in the faint glow of her bedside lamp. The crawling man skittered right up to the foot of the bed and reared back on its haunches, its head twitching bird-like as it stared at us with eyes that glinted milky white in the dimness. For the first time, I got a clear look at the thing's face, and the sight of it turned my blood to ice water in my veins. It was a man, but a man twisted beyond all recognition by some unimaginable evil. His features were gaunt and skeletal, his skin pulled taut over jutting bones, his lipless mouth frozen in a hideous rictus grin that revealed far too many needle-sharp teeth. And those eyes, soulless pits of pure malevolence that bored into us with an intensity that felt like a physical force, stripping us bare, laying all our deepest fears and vulnerabilities out like glistening viscera. Sasha whimpered, shrinking back against her pillows as the thing drank her in with its dead, hungry gaze. It swiveled its head to face her directly, its neck moving with an impossible boneless fluidity, and let out a grating, chittering sound that might have been laughter. Molly lunged again, barking wildly, fangs flashing as she charged the horrid thing. I screamed at her to stop, terrified that it would hurt her, but it was too late. The crawling man's arm shot out with blinding speed, seizing Molly by the throat and lifting her off the ground like a rag doll. She thrashed and struggled in its grip, her paws scrabbling frantically at the air, but it held her fast, its spindly fingers digging cruelly into her fur. Sasha and I could only watch in mute, paralyzed horror as the thing drew our beloved dog closer to its face, its milky eyes glittering with sadistic glee. Just when I thought I would have to witness the unthinkable, the crawling man flung Molly aside with casual brutality, sending her crashing into the far wall with a yelp of pain. She crumpled to the floor in a dazed heap, her flanks heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. The thing's attention shifted back to Sasha, and it dropped to all fours, skittering up the length of the bed with nauseating speed. Sasha screamed and threw herself sideways, tumbling to the floor in a tangle of limbs and bedsheets. I lurched toward her reflexively, desperate to put myself between her and the unholy predator that sought to violate her. But before I could reach her, a guttural snarl ripped through the room, and Molly barreled past me in a blur of brindle fur and rippling muscle. Our brave, loyal girl had recovered herself and launched back into the fray, determined to protect her humans at any cost. She hit the crawling man like a battering ram, her powerful jaws clamping down on one scrawny arm and wrenching it backward with all her considerable strength. The thing let out a shrill, inhuman shriek of rage and pain, and its free hand raked across Molly's face, laying her cheek open to the bone. Blood splattered the walls and carpet as the two titans grappled, a primal ballet of savagery and fury. Molly held on like a champion, her teeth sunk deep into the crawling man's hideous flesh, even as its talons gouged bloody furrows into her hide. But for all her courage and ferocity, she was only mortal, and her adversary was a thing beyond nature, beyond sanity. With a sickening crack, it wrenched its arm free of her jaws, leaving ragged strips of meat dangling from the wound. Molly staggered back, her flanks heaving, blood sheeting from her mangled face and neck. The crawling man darted forward, its movements a dizzying blur, and seized her about the throat once more, its fingers sinking deep into her fur until they met flesh and bone. Sasha screamed, high and shrill, as the thing lifted Molly off her feet, its gruesome face split in a leering death's head grin. What happened next will haunt me until the day I draw my last breath. With a savage twist of its wrist, the crawling man snapped Molly's neck like a dry twig. The crack of vertebrae echoed through the room with obscene finality, and our beloved dog went limp, her soulful brown eyes glazing over as the light of life fled her broken body. The thing flung Molly's corpse aside with a contemptuous flick of its wrist, and she hit the floor with a dull, meaty thud, her head lolling at an unnatural angle. Sasha wailed, a wordless keen of grief and horror, and threw herself toward Molly's body, heedless of the crawling man looming over her. I lunged after her, knowing I had to get her away from that voracious predator before it could lay its awful hands on her again. But the thing seemed to have tired of its sport, at least for the moment. With a chittering hiss that set my teeth on edge, it dropped back to all fours and skittered out of the room, moving with that same dizzying speed. Its macabre silhouette flickered and danced on the walls as it scuttled down the hallway, fading into the gloom like a half-remembered nightmare. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, Sasha and I clung to each other on the blood-stained floor, shaking with the aftershocks of adrenaline and anguish. Molly lay in a crumpled heap a few feet away, her sightless eyes staring at nothing, her fur matted with gore. The metallic reek of blood hung thick in the air, mingling obscenely with the lingering stench of the crawling man, an ancient charnel feeder that made bile rise in the back of my throat. Helpless sobs racked Sasha's slender frame as the full weight of what we'd just witnessed crashed over her. I held her as tightly as I could, hot tears streaking down my own face, my mind reeling as I tried to process the sheer wanton brutality of what had just transpired. In the space of a few horrific minutes, our stalwart protector had been slain before our eyes, torn apart by a fiend straight out of the blackest pits of hell. The crawling man had just made it abundantly clear that it was no mere shade or specter, no lost soul seeking closure or absolution. It was a malevolent entity that reveled in causing pain and suffering, a sadistic predator that would stop at nothing to terrorize and torment us. And with Molly gone, we were more vulnerable than ever before. As I rocked my sister in my arms, whispering broken words of comfort that rang hollow even to my own ears, a bitter, despairing certainty lodged itself in my heart like a poisoned barb. The crawling man wasn't finished with us. Not by a long shot. It had only given us a small taste of the horrors it was capable of inflicting. And it would be back to finish the job, to shatter our minds and claim our souls for its own. It was only a matter of when, not if. The days that followed Molly's brutal murder were some of the bleakest of our young lives. Sasha withdrew into herself, spending hours huddled in bed, her eyes glazed and distant, responding to me in monosyllables, if at all. Our parents were at a loss, unable to comprehend the full extent of the trauma we'd endured. How could we even begin to explain the mind-rending evil we'd witnessed? The malign, otherworldly forces that had torn our family asunder. We told them Molly had gotten out somehow, that we'd found her savaged body in the woods behind our property the next morning. It was a thin, feeble lie, but the alternative, the awful, unspeakable truth, was more than they could bear. They arranged a small, somber funeral for our loyal companion, and we buried her in a sunny spot beneath the old oak tree she'd love to nap under. Sasha and I clung to each other like shipwrecked survivors adrift in a sea of grief and terror, the sole witnesses to an atrocity that defied all reason and sanity. We barely slept, barely ate, jumping at every creaking floorboard and rattling shutter, our nerves frayed to the breaking point by the constant, gnawing dread of the crawling man's return. I took to carrying our grandfather's old hunting knife with me everywhere, the solid weight of the steel blade a small comfort against the looming specter of the creature's inevitable resurgence. Logically, I knew it would do little good against a being that could shrug off a pit bull's crushing jaws, but it made me feel marginally less helpless, less at the mercy of an implacable, insatiable evil. Sasha refused to set foot in her bedroom, unable to bear the sight of Molly's blood soaked into the floorboards, the lingering reek of the crawling man's fetid presence. She started sleeping in my room, curled up in a tight ball on a makeshift cot beside my bed, as if the scant inches separating us could somehow keep the nightmares at bay. But even the small solace of being near each other was tainted by the insidious dread that crept into every corner of our lives, a malignant miasma that left us feeling sullied and vulnerable, our every waking moment poisoned by the certainty of further horrors to come. We moved through our days in a haze of exhausted paranoia, our conversations stilted and perfunctory, our laughter, once so free and easy, now forced and brittle. And through it all, the sense of being watched, being stalked, being marked for some unspeakable violation, only grew stronger and more oppressive with each passing day. Every lengthening shadow and creaking floorboard became a fresh source of dread, a reminder of the crawling man's malign presence and the gruesome fate it had in store for us. The full extent of that fate became hideously apparent on a moonless, starless night about a week after Molly's death. Sasha and I were huddled together on the narrow cot, clinging to each other like frightened children, when a soft, grating sound reached our ears. It was a sound I'd heard before, in the darkest depths of my most suffocating nightmares. The spidery skitter of malformed limbs on aged wood, the dry, chitinous rasp of something ancient and obscene dragging itself through the gloom. My heart seized in my chest, and Sasha went rigid beside me, her nails digging into my arm hard enough to draw blood. The sound grew louder, nearer, resolving into the purposeful staccato rhythm of the crawling man's macabre gait. It was coming up the stairs, making no attempt to hide its approach, as if savoring our mounting terror like a rare delicacy. The bedroom door creaked open with agonizing slowness, and a shadow darker than the moonless night oozed into the room, its spidery limbs bent at unnatural angles, its lipless mouth frozen in a permanent rictus of cruel amusement. I fumbled for the hunting knife I'd stowed beneath my pillow, my fingers numb and clumsy with panic. Sasha whimpered and shrank back against the wall, abject horror etched into every line of her ashen face. The crawling man skittered closer, moving with a loathsome, boneless fluidity that sent icy rivulets of revulsion down my spine. It reared up on its hind limbs, its milky eyes boring into us with a predatory hunger that turned my bowels to water. A low, guttural hiss slithered from its throat, thick with malice and obscene promise. In a burst of panicked bravado, I raised the knife in a white-knuckled grip, awkwardly brandishing the gleaming blade with a shaking hand. "Stay back," I croaked, my voice cracking with a terror I couldn't hope to conceal. "Stay away from my sister, you monster." The crawling man cocked its head at the blade, a hideously human gesture rendered nightmarish by the impossible angles of its neck and face. Then a sound bubbled up from that pulsing, lipless maw, a rasping, wheezing cackle of amusement that sent gooseflesh rippling across my skin. With a flicker of movement almost too swift to track, the thing lunged forward, its taloned fingers lashing out to seize my wrist in an iron grip. Tendons popped and bones ground together as it wrenched my arm up and back, tearing a scream from my throat. The knife clattered to the floor, my deadened fingers no longer capable of holding it. Sasha cried out my name, her voice high and thin with panic, and latched onto my other arm, trying desperately to pull me back. But the crawling man's strength was monstrous, inhuman, and it dragged me inexorably closer, hauling my face up to its own. This close, I could smell the charnel reek wafting from its distended mouth, could see the squirming shadows gathering in the filmy depths of its eyes. It hissed again, a grating, sibilant sound that wormed its way into the cracks in my sanity. And I felt something in me shatter, some integral piece of my selfhood crumbling to dust beneath the onslaught of that eldritch malevolence. The crawling man shoved me aside with contemptuous ease, sending me tumbling to the floor in a sprawl of nerveless limbs. I struggled to rise, to throw myself between the fiend and my sister, but my body wouldn't obey, paralyzed by a primal, bladder-loosening terror. Sasha screamed, a high, piercing wail of abject horror as the crawling man's spidery limbs encircled her slender body, its razor talons sinking into her flesh with obscene intimacy. It hauled her to its chest with terrible gentleness, the jutting bones of its emaciated frame digging into her soft curves. She flailed and struggled against its hideous embrace, revulsion and terror lending desperate strength to her blows. But it was like fighting the coils of some great serpent. The more she writhed, the tighter its grip became, until she could scarcely draw breath to scream. The crawling man lowered its face to the crook of Sasha's neck, its lipless mouth peeling back to expose rows of needle-sharp teeth. A grotesquely long, glistening tongue snaked out to lap at the rapid flutter of her jugular, savoring the salt-sweet tang of her fear sweat. Sasha whimpered and shuddered, her eyes rolling back in her head as the mind-shredding wrongness of that obscene touch overwhelmed her. And as I lay there, forced to witness the unthinkable violation of the one person I cherished most in all the world, I knew with sickening certainty that this was only the beginning of the crawling man's depravities. It would shatter our bodies and feast on our sanity, a malevolent cancer burrowing into the very core of our beings. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that we could do to stop it. How we survived the mind-flaying horrors of that endless, hellish night, I'll never know. The crawling man toyed with us like a cat with wounded mice, delighting in our futile struggles and muffled screams. It dragged its razor talons across our flesh in slow, meticulous patterns, leaving livid, bloody furrows in its wake. It lapped the tears and sweat from our contorted faces with its obscenely long tongue, panting with an ecstasy that was almost sexual in its intensity. And it did other things, foul, blasphemous things, that I can't bear to put into words. Things that will haunt our dreams and poison our waking moments until they lay us in our graves. The mind recoils from such unthinkable violations, desperate to preserve some last tattered shreds of innocence in the face of an evil beyond all human comprehension. Dawn broke slowly, sullenly, as if the sun itself were loath to touch the scene of such unbridled depravity. The crawling man hissed and cringed at the first anemic rays of light filtering through the bedroom curtains, its flesh sizzling and smoldering where they brushed against its foul hide. Sasha and I shivered on the floor in a spreading pool of our own blood and terror sweat, too drained and broken to take advantage of our tormentor's momentary weakness. With a final, spiteful hiss, the crawling man relinquished its grip on our battered flesh and skittered into the shadowed recesses of the room, its silhouette dancing and blurring in a way that made my gorge rise. Gradually, the last echoes of its skittering passage dwindled into the uncaring silence, but the charnel reek of its presence lingered, a miasma of corruption that left me lightheaded and retching. Sasha lay curled in a fetal ball, her eyes glassy and distant, dried blood flaking from the ragged furrows the crawling man had gouged in her flesh. I dragged myself to her side, wincing as my abused muscles and shredded skin screamed in protest, and gathered her into my arms. She was shivering violently, her skin cold and clammy, her breath coming in shallow gasps. I held her as tightly as I dared, willing my own meager warmth and strength into her. "Sasha," I whispered, my voice a hoarse, broken rasp. "Sasha, please stay with me. Don't let it win. Don't let it break you." She stirred in my arms, a faint, agonized moan slipping past her cracked lips. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her head to meet my gaze. Her once vibrant eyes were dull and haunted, clouded with a despair that made my heart constrict. But beneath the horror and the anguish, I saw a flickering spark of something else, something fierce and unbreakable, a defiant ember that refused to be snuffed out. I won't, she rasped, fresh tears spilling down her bruised and bloodied face. We can't let it win. We have to fight. I'm a 19-year-old college student named Ethan who took a summer job as a camp counselor at the Whispering Pines Nature Preserve in rural West Virginia. As an environmental science major, the opportunity to teach kids about nature and the outdoors was perfect. But I had no idea the terror that awaited me in those dark woods. The preserve spans 163 acres of dense forest and winding trails. A narrow creek snakes through the property, feeding into an expansive marsh that covers a third of the total area. It's a remote, eerie place where the trees seem to watch your every move and the shadows play tricks on your mind. That fateful week in early July, I was leading the nocturnal animals camp with two other counselors, Caleb and Owen. Since we were teaching the kids about creatures of the night, our activities ran from 6 p.m. until 10:30 p.m. each evening, when the inky darkness fully enveloped the woods. Caleb was an experienced outdoorsman, strong and confident in the wilderness. Owen had been a counselor at Whispering Pines for several years and knew every inch of the preserve. As the newcomer, I sensed the two of them enjoyed messing with me and my campers from time to time. Nothing serious, just silly pranks and spooky stories. I never imagined how horrifyingly real those stories would become. I was in charge of 10 campers between the ages of 8 and 11. Luckily, they were a well-behaved bunch who always listened and followed the rules. We were having a smooth week filled with fun games and activities centered around the nocturnal theme. But as I would soon learn, something far more sinister than owls and raccoons lurked in the marsh, waiting to drag us into a nightmare. On that Thursday night, with the humidity thick in the air and mosquitoes swarming, Caleb suggested we take the campers on a special solo hike. The kids would walk a stretch of trail alone, with counselors stationed at the beginning and end to keep watch. It was meant to build confidence and independence, to show them they could navigate the dark forest on their own. Caleb insisted we use the Marsh Loop Trail, the longest, most remote path in the entire preserve that wound through the dense, swampy woodland for over a mile. When he brought it up, I noticed a strange smirk flash across Owen's face, so I assumed this was another attempt to playfully scare the rookie counselor. I brushed it off, as the marsh trail was actually one of my favorites for its eerie beauty and sense of isolation. If only I had known then where that path really led. We gathered our two groups of campers at the trailhead while Owen stayed behind to lead an activity at the main pavilion. After a final head count and flashlight check, Caleb headed to the opposite end of the loop so he could greet the kids as they finished. I remained at the start to send them off one at a time, spacing out their departures to give each child a true solitary experience. The first few campers entered the trail with nervous excitement, quickly swallowed up by the wall of forest. I continued releasing them at intervals, listening to their footsteps and giggles fade into the distance. Everything seemed to be going smoothly. But then there was Lucas, a timid 9-year-old absolutely terrified of the dark. He clung to my side, trembling, as the last of the other campers disappeared down the path. I couldn't bear to make him walk alone. Against my better judgment, I told Lucas he could hike the marsh trail with me. We would go together once everyone else had gone, so I could still keep my post at the start. It was a choice I would soon regret. With the other campers already deep in the marsh, Lucas and I set off down the narrow, twisting trail. The beams of our flashlights seemed feeble against the pressing darkness, barely illuminating the path more than a few steps ahead. Frustrated, I turned off my flickering light and instructed Lucas to do the same, hoping our eyes would adjust more easily to the moonlit gloom. As we shuffled onward, a sudden slapping sound erupted behind us, like wet meat being hurled against a wall. Lucas jumped and grabbed my hand in a vice grip. We froze, holding our breath, straining to hear over the frantic thumping of our hearts. But the forest had gone eerily silent, even the ever-present drone of crickets and frogs vanishing in an instant. It's okay, buddy. Probably just some beavers playing in the creek, I reassured him, trying to keep my voice steady. They like to splash around at night. It's nothing to worry about. But worry gnawed at the edges of my mind, even as we resumed our careful progress. The slapping started again, this time from somewhere ahead of us in the marsh. Rhythmic yet erratic, organic but unnatural. I told myself it was the counselors pranking me, that Owen must be out there in waders, smacking the muck to give us a scare. "All right, Owen, very funny," I called out, trying to sound more annoyed than unnerved. "You're freaking Lucas out, so knock it off. This isn't cool." Silence was my only reply, silence so deep and thick it felt like being smothered in heavy wool. Not even a rustle of leaves or hum of insects. Pure nothingness. A knot of dread twisted in my gut. I knew then something was very wrong. Scanning the marsh, I desperately searched for any signs of Owen or an explanation for the hideous slaps still ringing out around us. But I saw only darkness and the wavering shadows of skeletal trees. Lucas whimpered and clung tighter. My confidence eroded with each passing second. Up ahead on the trail, a clump of cattails swayed and thrashed as if alive. I fumbled with my flashlight, finally clicking it on and aiming the quavering beam at the reeds. What I saw drained the breath from my lungs and numbed my limbs with primal terror. 2 crimson orbs glowed in the marsh, pulsing with feral hunger. A hulking silhouette rose from the mire, its gnarled antlers dripping with gore and putrid vegetation. Time felt suspended as the creature and I locked eyes, predator and prey frozen in a horrific tableau. Then Lucas screamed, and the spell was broken. I snatched him up without thought and ran, his shriek still reverberating through the night. The slaps morphed into splashes as something huge gave chase, trampling through the shallow water in ground-eating strides. I didn't dare look back until we broke from the marsh onto a welcome stretch of dry trail. In that fleeting backward glance, I witnessed a sight that will haunt me until my dying day. The thing had emerged from the bog on all fours, its body a twisted mass of rotting flesh clinging to an exposed skeleton. A deer's skull where its head should be, replete with jagged fangs and those awful burning eyes. Lucas wailed in my arms, the sobs of a child confronted by the purest embodiment of fear and evil. I held him close as I ran harder than ever before, lungs and legs pumping, the creature's fetid breath gusting against my neck. Ahead, through a break in the trees, firelight flickered. The other campers gathered around the end of the trail, unaware of the horror bearing down upon them. "Run!" I screamed at them, my words ragged. "Get out of here now!" But as I stumbled into the circle and spun to face the monster, I saw nothing. The woods behind me stood quiet and still. No antlers, no blood-red eyes, no crashing pursuit. Just the fading echoes of my own heavy breathing. The campers stared at me in mute shock, Lucas still blubbering into my chest. Caleb pushed his way into the circle, bewilderment and concern etched on his features. "What happened?" he demanded, taking me by the arm and pulling me aside. With a shaking voice, I recounted our terrifying encounter in halting pieces, my eyes darting to the tree line in fear of the creature's return. But Caleb's face remained inscrutable, his lips pursed in a thin line. When I finished, he studied me for a long moment before turning to address the campers. "All right, everyone, I think we've had enough excitement for tonight," he announced, his tone artificially light. "Let's put out this fire and head back to the pavilion. Your parents will be arriving soon to pick you up." As the kids set about dousing the flames with practiced motions, Caleb leaned in close to me, his voice low and urgent. "Listen, Ethan, I need you to pull it together, okay? We can't have you falling apart in front of the campers. Just focus on getting everyone back safely. We'll figure the rest out later." I could only nod mutely, my mind still reeling. Caleb squeezed my shoulder before moving off to help herd the children towards the pavilion. Lucas remained glued to my side, his small hand clutched in mine like a lifeline. I felt an overwhelming urge to comfort him, to promise the danger had passed, but the words rang hollow even in my own head. The hike back seemed to take hours, every rustle of leaves and snapping twig making my heart hammer against my ribs. By the time we emerged into the welcome light of the pavilion, my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the night chill. Owen hurried over as we approached, clearly confused by our early return. He took one look at my ashen face and Lucas's tear-streaked cheeks and pulled Caleb aside, whispering harshly. I caught only fragments of their exchange. "Told you not to," Owen hissed. "Couldn't have known," Caleb shot back. "Happens again. Our jobs?" Caleb silenced him with a sharp gesture as I drew near, then turned to face me with an expression of forced calm. "Why don't you take Lucas inside and get him settled?" he suggested. "Owen and I will call the other parents to come get their kids. It's been a long night." Too drained to argue, I shuffled into the main building, leading Lucas to a worn couch in the corner. He curled up against my side, exhaustion quickly claiming him. But no rest would find me that night. I sat rigid and watchful, my mind spinning with questions and terrible visions of grasping skeletal hands. It felt like mere minutes before the concerned families arrived, Caleb and Owen handling the explanations with vague references to my sudden illness and assurances that all was well. I mechanically helped Lucas gather his things, then watched as his mother led him to their waiting car, shooting me a final puzzled glance over her shoulder. And then, as the last taillights disappeared down the gravel drive, I found myself enveloped by a sudden, suffocating quiet. Turning, I saw Owen and Caleb standing a short distance away, their faces grim. They approached slowly, as if worried I might bolt. I felt like a trapped animal. "Ethan," Caleb began, his tone conciliatory. "About what happened out there." "You saw it too," I blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. "The creature in the marsh, with the antlers and the eyes. It chased us. It was going to... I couldn't finish, my throat closing around the awful possibilities. Caleb and Owen exchanged a heavy glance. "We need to talk," Owen said quietly. "Inside." The pavilion's interior seemed far too bright and ordinary for the conversation I knew was coming. Owen indicated for me to take a seat at one of the long dining tables, while he and Caleb remained standing, their stances tense. "First off," Caleb began, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you stays between us. This isn't something we share with the campers or their families. Ever. Got it?" I nodded, my mouth dry. Caleb sighed and ran a hand through his close-cropped hair. "That thing you saw tonight? It's not the first time it's been spotted around here. There have been stories circulating for years, old folk tales the locals whisper about some sort of marsh demon or vengeful spirit. Most people brush it off as backwoods superstition, but..." He trailed off, glancing at Owen, who took up the thread. "But every so often someone sees it for themselves, a hiker or hunter, even a counselor a few summers back. They all tell the same story. A rotting monster with antlers that comes charging out of the swamp. Some folks think it's guarding something out there, or maybe hunting." A shudder rippled through me at the memory of those crimson eyes boring into mine, the sensation of being stalked like helpless prey. Has it ever hurt anyone?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not as far as we know," Caleb replied. "It seems content to scare people off, like a warning. Those who see it directly tend to clear out of the area pretty quick and never come back." I felt a flicker of anger amidst my fear. "If you knew this thing was out there, why did you let the solo hikes happen? Why didn't you warn me?" Owen at least had the decency to look chagrined. "Honestly, we thought the stories were exaggerated, more of a spooky campfire yarn than a real threat. And the creature sightings are so rare. It didn't seem like a big deal until tonight," Caleb finished. "But now we have to deal with the fallout, which means keeping this quiet and making sure word doesn't spread." The implications hung heavy in the air between us. They expected me to help cover this up, to bury my trauma and carry on like nothing happened. I thought of Lucas, How his tearful face would haunt my nightmares. The weight of that burden already felt suffocating. "I can't just pretend this didn't happen," I said, my voice cracking. "That thing is dangerous. It can't be allowed to hunt out there, not with kids around. We have to do something." "Do what exactly?" Caleb asked, a harsh edge creeping into his tone. "Call in a posse to hunt down a creature that by all logic shouldn't even exist? How well do you think that will go over?" "Ethan, I get it," Owen said, laying a hand on my shoulder. "What you went through was terrifying and messed up. But think about the bigger picture here. If this gets out, the preserve could be shut down. The camp too. Is that what you want?" I wanted to scream that I didn't care, that no summer job was worth putting innocent lives at risk. But in that moment, faced with their united front, my resolve crumbled. I was just a scared kid in over my head, grasping for solid ground. "Okay," I heard myself mutter. "I won't say anything, but I can't stay here. I have to leave. Tonight." Caleb nodded slowly, his expression a mix of relief and something harder to read. Pity, perhaps. Or guilt. "I think that's for the best," he said. "Take a few days to collect yourself. If anyone asks, we'll say you had a family emergency and had to cut your contract short." The matter settled, at least in their minds, Caleb and Owen set about closing up the pavilion for the night. I remained seated, staring blankly at the scarred tabletop, my mind a jangle of fear and confusion and bleak despair. When Owen touched my arm some minutes later, I nearly leapt out of my skin. "Come on, I'll drive you back to the dorms," he offered. "You shouldn't be alone right now." I followed him without protest, a numb hollowness spreading through my chest. As we passed into the staff parking lot, gravel crunching underfoot, I hesitated. Turned back for a final look at the darkened preserve, its trees standing sentinel beneath an uncaring sky. Something moved along the forest's edge, a flicker of shadow in moonlight and antler. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving me to wonder if it was ever truly there at all. A shaky exhale escaped my lips, fogging in the cool night air. Then I climbed into the passenger seat of Owen's waiting truck and closed the door, sealing away the horror and the marsh and the red-eyed nightmare, determined to leave them far, far behind. But deep down, I knew I would never truly escape the Whispering Pines, that the memory of what lurked in those woods would follow me, asleep and awake, for all the rest of my days. A terror made only worse by knowing it remained out there still, patient and hungry and poised to hunt again. It's been 1 year since that night at Whispering Pines, 1 year of jumping at shadows and waking sweat-drenched from crimson-tinged dreams. 1 year of lying to family, to friends, to myself that all was well. That I'd simply had my fill of the camp counselor life and decided to move on. No one questioned it, least of all my parents. They'd always considered my fondness for the outdoors a phase, something to be moved past. I threw myself into my studies with a single-minded fervor, determined to lose myself in the safe, quantifiable world of environmental data and research. But no amount of facts and figures could fully erase the memories that haunted me. In the strained silences of my dorm room late at night, I couldn't help but wonder about the other counselors, about the preserve. Had anyone else encountered the creature? Had there been more attacks? The not knowing gnawed at me. Despite my best efforts to leave it buried, I found myself drawn to any scrap of information about Whispering Pines. Online searches turned up precious little. A bare-bones website with camp schedules and smiling staff photos, bland local news articles about community events held on the grounds. No mention of monsters or missing hikers. Radio silence from Owen and Caleb, not that I expected anything more. Our final conversation had held the unspoken agreement to never speak of that night again. But secrets have a way of festering, of bubbling up from the dark places we try to hide them. And so, as the anniversary of my flight from the preserve approached, I came to a grim decision. I had to go back. Had to see for myself if the horror still lurked in the marsh. Maybe then I could find some measure of closure, or at least the power to move forward. I told myself I'd simply drive by, take a quick look around the edges of the property. I didn't need to set foot on those cursed trails again. The trip up from the university was a blur of white-knuckled hands on the steering wheel and a tight, fluttering tension in my gut. The closer I drew to Whispering Pines, the more my body rebelled, heart hammering and lungs seizing as if my very cells remembered the terror and screamed at me to turn back. But I pressed on, watching the quaint mountain towns and misty valleys roll by with grim determination. I reached the long gravel drive by mid-afternoon, a time of day that should have felt safe and mundane. But as I turned onto the rutted track, tires crunching and kicking up dust, a chill settled over me despite the warm June sun. The thick forest crowding the road seemed to swallow the light and sound, leaving an unnatural hush interrupted only by the labored rumbling of my ancient engine. The parking lot was nearly deserted when I pulled in, just a few scattered staff vehicles glinting dully in the shade. The camp itself appeared eerily unchanged, as if the intervening year had been nothing more than a long, unsettling dream. The same weathered buildings, the same slightly shabby pavilion, the same sense of encroaching wilderness barely held at bay. I turned off the ignition and simply sat for a long moment, trying to compose myself, to remember how to breathe evenly. A sudden rap on my window startled a yelp from my throat. I jerked around to see Caleb peering in at me, his expression unreadable. He motioned for me to get out. I complied on shaky legs, my tongue cleaved to the roof of my mouth. "Ethan, wasn't expecting to see you back here." His tone was neutral, but his eyes flashed with something I couldn't quite parse. Annoyance, apprehension. I didn't plan to stay. I just needed to. I trailed off helplessly, unsure how to put my tangled motivations into words. Caleb sighed, scrubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. He looked tired, I realized. Tired and worn in a way that went beyond a long day wrangling campers. "I get it. I do. But you shouldn't have come back, man. We had an agreement." I couldn't let it go, I admitted, hating the pleading note that crept into my voice. "I have to know if it's still out there. If anything else has happened. Please, Caleb. I'm going crazy imagining the worst." He was silent for a long beat, gaze distant and troubled. When he finally spoke, his words hit like a punch to the gut. "There's been another sighting. One of the newer counselors, a girl named Jenna. She was out on the marsh trail a few nights ago and it came for her, just like with you and Lucas." I felt the blood drain from my face, my knees going watery. Did it? She's alive, shaken up as hell, but physically okay. Told the same story about a rotting deer thing chasing her through the bog. Caleb kicked at a tuft of grass, jaw clenched. "We've pulled the solo hikes from the schedule, and we're keeping a closer eye on the property borders, but short of closing down completely, there's not much else we can do." A swell of impotent rage suffused me, hot and clawing. "Why are you still letting this happen? How can you justify putting more people at risk? This place should be shut down and that thing destroyed." Caleb rounded on me, his composure slipping. "You don't think I want that? You have no idea the pressure we're under to keep this quiet and keep things running smoothly. The preserve is too important to too many people. It's not that simple." I opened my mouth to argue, but he cut me off with a sharp gesture. "I know you went through hell, Ethan. I know you're scarred by it. But you walking in here and raising a stink is only going to make things worse. For everyone." The fight drained out of me as quickly as it had surged, leaving behind a cold, leaden numbness. He was right. I was just one damaged person railing against a force too big and dark to conquer. The helplessness of it, the inescapable feeling of being trapped and diminished by my own terror, brought shameful tears to my eyes. Caleb's expression softened incrementally. He reached out to grip my shoulder. Go home, Ethan. Try to put this behind you for real. We'll handle things on our end. I could only nod mutely, vision blurred and chest aching. He squeezed once before releasing me and stepping back. I turned to climb into my car, limbs moving as if through molasses. As I reached for the door handle, a thought occurred to me. I paused, throat working. "What about Owen?" I asked, voice hoarse. Does he still believe it's under control?" Caleb hesitated, a shadow flickering over his face. He's not here anymore. Moved on to a different job out of state." I searched his shuttered expression, a niggling sense of wrongness worming through my exhausted mind. But I was suddenly just so tired of questions, of doubts and fears and nebulous half-answers. I needed to be away from this place, its oppressive atmosphere and ugly secrets. I got into my car without another word, fumbling the key into the ignition and reversing out of the lot a bit too fast. Caleb stood watching in the rearview mirror as I drove away, his form receding and then vanishing into the eternal green gloom of whispering pines. The drive back to the university was a numb, mechanical affair. I felt hollowed out, scoured clean by the brief but intense emotional storm. Caleb's revelations played over and over in my head. Jenna's encounter, the pulling of solo hikes, Owen's abrupt departure. None of it brought me any closer to closure. If anything, I was left with more grim threads to worry loose, more avenues for my relentless imagination. I made it back to my dorm in a kind of fugue state, only realizing as I stumbled through the door that night had fallen while I drove. My roommate was mercifully absent, his half of the small space dark and untouched. I sat heavily on the edge of my bed, staring blankly at the wall, waiting for the numbness to recede. Waiting to feel something, anything, besides this gnawing pit in my center. When my phone buzzed in my pocket, I almost ignored it. Almost let it go to voicemail and dealt with it in the morning. But some buried flicker of self-preservation warned me that a midnight call rarely brought good tidings. With numb fingers, I fished the device out and glanced at the glowing screen. Unknown number. A pang of unease broke through the static in my head. I answered with a wary, "Hello?" Ragged breathing greeted me, hitching and uneven. Then, "Ethan, it's Owen." My stomach dropped, a sick swoop of dread. I sat up straight, free hand nodding in my bed sheets. "Owen, what? I thought you left Whispering Pines. Caleb said you moved away." A harsh bark of laughter, more unhinged than amused. "Is that what he told you? Figures. Caleb always was a master of telling people what they needed to hear." "I don't understand. What's going on? Why are you calling me in the middle of the night?" Frustration warred with a growing sense that something was very, very wrong. "Because you're the only one who might listen. The only one who knows the truth about what's out there in the marsh." My mouth went dry, tongue suddenly too large for my jaw. "Caleb said there was another sighting. A counselor named Jenna. Is she the one who reached out to you?" "No, Ethan. Jenna is dead. Ripped apart and left scattered from the trail to the creek bed." Owen's voice broke, a raw and jagged sound. "And it's all my fault. I'm the one who sent her out there alone." A high, thin ringing started up in my ears. I felt suddenly lightheaded, the edges of my vision sparkling. "Dead? But Caleb said she just had a scare. That she was shaken up, but okay." "He lied to you, Ethan. Just like he's been lying to everyone. To the campers and the families and the authorities. All to keep his precious preserve running, no matter the cost." Owen sucked in a shuddering breath, the sound rattling over the phone line. When he continued, his words tumbled out in a desperate rush. "It's getting bolder. The creature. At first it seemed content with just stalking and frightening, but now there's a body. A life snuffed out because we refused to acknowledge the danger. Because we cared more about reputation than safety." His voice took on a pleading edge, cracking under the strain. "I can't keep this buried anymore, Ethan. I won't be complicit in hiding Jenna's death, in acting like the thing that killed her isn't still out there, waiting for its next victim. Jesus, Owen, I breathed, horror and disbelief swirling into a sickening whirlpool in my gut. Have you gone to the police? The Park Service? And tell them what? That a rotting deer monster is attacking people in the woods. They'd lock me up and sedate me for spinning that tale. A bitter huff. Caleb would just deny and discredit me anyway. That's why I need you, Ethan. I need your help to stop this once and for all. Stop it how? What are you planning to do? A sense of mounting unease prickled along my spine. I'm going back out there tonight, to the place where Jenna died, and I'm going to kill that abomination or die trying. My heart seized, a panicked flutter against my ribs. Oh, and no, you can't. It's suicide. What choice do I have? I can't live with this on my conscience. I have to try to make it right. His tone was flat and resolute, devoid of hope or doubt, the voice of a man who had already accepted his fate. I opened my mouth to argue, to beg him to reconsider, but he cut me off. I didn't call for you to talk me out of it, Ethan. I called because I needed someone else to know the truth, in case I don't make it back. Then let me come with you, I said, the words spilling out unchecked. You can't face that thing alone. A humorless chuckle. Sorry, but I can't ask you to do that. This is my cross to bear. He ignored my continued protests, my desperate attempts to reason with him. Do me a favor, okay? If it goes bad for me, go to the authorities. Tell them everything Caleb's been hiding. For Jenna. And for everyone he's put at risk with his lies. I could only make a choked noise of assent, my vision swimming. This couldn't be happening. It had to be another nightmare, one I would soon wake from, shaking and clammy with sweat. Ethan, thank you. For believing me. For everything. The line went dead before I could muster a reply. I sat frozen, the dial tone droning in my ear as I stared at the darkened wall. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, low and mournful. A call to action. Or perhaps a farewell. I don't remember the drive back to Whispering Pines. Not really. It's a blur of dark roads and darker thoughts, of white-knuckled hands on the wheel and a leaden weight in my gut. I know I broke every speed limit, pushed my aging car to its limits as I raced against time and fate. But the specifics elude me, lost to the haze of panic and grim determination. All I could think of was Owen, out there in the marsh alone. Owen, who had reached out to me in his darkest hour, begging for help and absolution. I couldn't let him face that horror by himself. Couldn't sit idle knowing he might be marching to his death. Even if it meant confronting my own deepest fears, I had to try. I made it to the preserve in record time, gravel spraying as I slid into the empty lot. The night pressed close, thick and oppressive, the moon's wan light struggling to pierce the dense canopy. I was out of the car in seconds, pausing only to grab the heavy mag light from my trunk. A paltry weapon against the creature, but it was all I had. The trail to the marsh seemed to mock me, a narrow ribbon of packed dirt winding into the black maw of the forest. My heart hammered against my ribs as I started down it at a jog, breath puffing in the chill air. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot made me flinch and whirl, expecting to see those hellish red eyes looming out of the darkness. I don't know how long I ran, time slipping and stretching in the adrenaline haze. The trail curved and dipped, skirting the edge of the marsh, the fetid stench of stagnant water and decay thick in my nose. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I pushed on, terrified of what I might find. Or what might find me. The attack, when it came, was so sudden, so brutally shocking even though I had been braced for it. One moment I was pelting headlong down the path, the next I was tumbling, a searing line of pain raking across my back. I hit the ground hard, roll with the impact, scrabbling for purchase in the mud and rotting vegetation. Looming above me, backlit by the hazy moon, was the creature. It was every bit as nightmarish as I remembered. A twisted fusion of man and beast, of living flesh and necrotic decay. Its antlers dripped with blood and shredded skin. My skin, I realized with a nauseated lurch. Those feral crimson eyes blazed with a malevolent intelligence, pinning me with predatory hunger. I fumbled for the flashlight, fingers numb and clumsy, managed to thumb it on and swing the beam up into the creature's face. It flinched back with an enraged shriek, momentarily dazzled. I took my chance, lurching to my feet and staggering into the underbrush, heedless of direction. Thorns and branches tore at my clothes, my face. The creature's howls dogged my steps, spurring me to a shambling run. My back was a white-hot sheet of agony, my lungs laboring for each ragged gasp. But I ran as I had never run before, a prey animal operating on nothing but blind instinct and the will to survive. Time lost all meaning in that headlong flight, narrowing down to the burn of my muscles and the thunder of my pulse in my ears. The flashlight beam danced crazily ahead of me, illuminating flashes of grasping trees and glistening mud. I had no idea where I was or how far I'd gone. The marsh had swallowed me whole, an endless morass of darkness and snarled vegetation. When I burst from the tree line onto the grassy verge of the creek, it was so unexpected I nearly pitched face first into the sluggish water. I pinwheeled my arms, caught myself at the last second, stood hunched and gasping, trying to orient myself in the watery moonlight. That's when I saw the body. A mangled sprawl half in, half out of the creek, limbs bent at unnatural angles. Bile surged up my throat as I recognized the tattered remains of a Whispering Pines staff shirt, the dark hair matted with mud and gore. Owen. I was too late. A wordless keen of grief and horror tore from my chest. I stumbled toward him, heedless of the creature, of anything but the need to reach him, to do something, anything, to make this less horrifically, viscerally real. I never made it. A shadow fell over me, rank and hulking. I spun, flashlight swinging up, just as a massive fist crashed into the side of my head. The world exploded in a starburst of pain, then snuffed to utter blackness. I came to in a hospital bed, head pounding and back ablaze with stitched lacerations. Groggy and disoriented, I could only blink at the police officer looming over me, his face set in grim lines. Apparently a hiker had found me unconscious by the creek, half drowned and bleeding, and called 911. Park rangers had responded and medevaced me out. Owen's savaged body was recovered shortly after. The official story was a bear attack, a tragic, random act of nature. But the officer's shrewd gaze told a different tale. Locals knew about the creature, knew and kept it secret out of fear and morbid reverence. I was an outsider, a liability. My survival threw a wrench in their tidy cover-up. I told them everything then. The words poured out of me in a cathartic flood. The creature, Caleb's lies, Owen's fatal mission. I knew I sounded crazy, knew the officer would likely dismiss me as traumatized and confused. But I didn't care. I had to speak the truth, to honor Owen's dying wish. In the end, they buried it, the whole sordid affair. I was paid off and sent on my way with barely veiled threats about keeping my mouth shut. Whispering Pines closed for the season under the guise of restructuring. Caleb was quietly dismissed. Jenna and Owen's deaths swept under the rug of animal attacks and unfortunate accidents. But I knew the truth. Knew that the creature still lurked in the marsh, a malevolent presence waiting to kill again. And I knew that I could never fully escape the long shadow it cast over my life. That night would forever haunt me, a waking nightmare branded into my very soul. I left Whispering Pines behind, but it never really left me. Even now, miles and years distant, I sometimes catch a flash of crimson in the darkness, hear a rattling shriek on the night wind. And I remember the price of secrets kept, and evil left to fester. A campfire tale spoken in hushed whispers, a warning to the unwary. Beware the Whispering Pines, beware the marsh. For there are older and fouler things than men in the deep places of the world, and once awakened, their hunger knows no bounds. I was born and raised in the southern United States, a part of Louisiana to be exact. My father and grandfather taught me skills like hunting, fishing, camping, and bushcraft from a very young age, so it made sense that I always wanted to be outdoors. When I turned 25 in 2018, I decided to embark on a solo bow hunting trip. Just one night at my camp and a full day of hunting. I packed up my gear, informed my family of my plans, and set off into the woods. We lived close to the woods, and I would usually just walk to my typical hunting spot. But this time, an inexplicable instinct told me to bring my truck, despite the extra gas and effort it would require. Looking back, I'm certainly glad I listened to that instinct. I arrived at my campsite around 6:15 p.m. in mid-December, with barely enough remaining daylight to find a good parking spot. The woods were too thick to drive all the way in, so I had to walk the last stretch guided by my flashlight in the encroaching darkness. An eerie chill crept up my spine as I trekked alone through the black forest. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached my camp around 6:35 p.m. I immediately busied myself with essential tasks, gathering tinder and firewood, pitching my tent, organizing my gear for quick access in the morning. Focused on the routine, I could almost ignore the unnatural stillness and silence that hung heavy in the frigid air. With camp set up, I heated up a meager dinner of beans and sausages over the crackling fire. The dancing flames provided scant comfort against the oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. Eventually, fatigue overrode my unease, and I retreated into my tent, falling into a restless sleep atop my sleeping pad. Little did I know the true horrors that awaited me. Somewhere between 2 sags and 2:15 a.m., I jolted awake to absolute, deafening silence. This was not the natural quiet of a peaceful night. This was the ominous silence that only spells imminent danger in the wilderness. My own thudding heartbeat roared in my ears as I sat frozen in terror, revolver clutched in a white-knuckled grip. Then I heard it. The snap of twigs underfoot. Heavy, bipedal footsteps crunching through the underbrush, only 40 yards from my tent. Another hunter, perhaps? Unlikely. My family owned this property, and my father always informed me if someone else had permission to hunt here. A sense of wrongness settled like a stone in my gut. Inch by painstaking inch, I slowly unzipped the tent window and peered out into the night. That's when I saw him. The man. Just standing there between the trees, facing my tent. In that same moment, the nighttime forest noises abruptly resumed. Crickets, owl hoots, the rustling of small creatures. I shook my head, trying to clear the sleep fog. Surely my half-asleep mind was playing tricks on me, conjuring phantom apparitions in the shifting shadows. I repeated this reassurance until I half believed it myself, then eventually drifted back into an uneasy slumber. If only I had known then how wrong I was. At precisely 5 a.m., the alarm on my phone shrilled, piercing through my hazy consciousness. Time to begin the 2-mile hike through darkened woods to reach my tree stand before first light. I hastily gathered my pre-packed gear, assuming it was all accounted for from the night before, and set off into the gloom. That lack of double-checking would soon prove a grave mistake. About a mile into my trek, I froze at the sound of movement off to my right, just beyond the edge of the narrow trail. I crouched down, every muscle tensed in anticipation, waiting for whatever lurked in the blackness to reveal itself. Seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness, and then out stepped a whitetail buck into a shaft of pale moonlight. But something was off about the creature. It looked emaciated, mangy, its eyes clouded as if blind. Yet it still walked with the halting, alert gait of a wild deer, head swiveling, ears twitching, hooves cautiously stepping. Perhaps it was merely old and sickly, I reasoned. A twinge of pity fluttered in my chest. Best to quickly put the poor beast out of its misery. As dawn lightened the sky to a bleak gray, the deer drew closer, allowing me to make out more disturbing details. It was grotesquely skinny, its hide splotchy and discolored with patches of missing fur that oozed with dark ichor. A putrid stench preceded it, gagging me with the fetor of rotting flesh. But the antlers, deformed and twisted into unnatural shapes, defied any logical explanation. At this proximity, any thoughts of claiming a trophy or harvest vanished. I only wanted to end the animal's clear suffering. I reached back to draw an arrow from the sling quiver on my back and sliced my thumb open on an upward-facing broadhead. Distracted in my haste the day before, I failed to notice my brother had replaced some of the arrows incorrectly after borrowing them. My involuntary yelp of pain rent the pre-dawn hush, and I braced for the deer to bolt, but it never did. Instead, a hideous, distorted scream pierced my eardrums, followed by a deep, guttural growl that resonated from no deer's throat. I watched in horror as the emaciated creature rose up on its back legs, baring sharp, yellowed teeth in an unmistakably threatening grin. Primal terror paralyzed me as this macabre imitation of nature stared into my soul with soulless, glowing eyes. The drive to run, to flee as fast as my legs could carry me, warred with the certainty that any sudden movement would trigger a deadly pursuit. Blood pounding, pulse roaring in my head, time seemed to slow to a crystalline crawl. Fight or flight finally kicked in. With desperate speed, I knocked an arrow and sent it flying at the abomination, a shot that should have been instantly fatal. But the shaft merely sank into sickly flesh with little effect. Frantic now, I loosed a second arrow that found its mark in the creature's neck. An unholy scream rent the air as the beast spun and galloped off, seamlessly switching between bipedal lurch and quadrupedal lope with a fluidity that defied reason. It stopped at the tree line, fixing me with one last baleful yellow glare before melting into the shadows. I didn't wait around to see if it would return. I ran. Every fiber of my being propelled me as I crashed heedlessly through the underbrush, brambles tearing at clothes and skin, lungs and muscles burning with the effort. 13 minutes. That's all it took to cover the distance back to my truck that had taken almost an hour the day before. I flung my gear carelessly in the back and tore out of there at reckless speed, desperate to put distance between myself and that phantasmagorical horror. It took me weeks to work up the nerve to return to that campsite and collect my abandoned gear. When I finally did, I was met with a scene of utter destruction. My tent had been shredded, its tattered remains strewn about like the work of a savage beast. The meager food stores had been raided, torn packaging and gnawed scraps littering the forest floor. Even the books I had brought to pass the time sat in sad tatters, pages ripped asunder by merciless claws. I still have no name for the entity I encountered in those woods. A skinwalker? Wendigo? The dreaded Rougarou of my Louisiana roots? Folklore had placed such horrors in locales steeped in native tradition, not the place of my ancestors. Yet my people had legends too, chilling fireside tales of soul-devouring monstrosities. Perhaps those warnings, those whispered secrets, held more truth than I ever dared imagine. In the years since, I sometimes glimpse a sickly, emaciated deer watching me from the tree line when I visit home. Part of me wants to return to those shadowed woods, to track down the unnatural thing and destroy it once and for all. But as far as I know, it hasn't claimed any other victims. Yet. Maybe I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, my path crossing that of an eldritch being by mere chance. But the hatred, the malevolence in its gaze as it bared vicious teeth, that spoke of more than animal instinct, of a twisted intelligence that marked me, that let me escape with my life only to keep me forever glancing over my shoulder, waiting for the day it comes to collect its due. The experience changed me, etched itself into my very marrow. A darkness took root, a gnawing paranoia that colors even the brightest day in shades of dread. I find myself shying away from the tree line, an inexplicable certainty that hungry eyes track my every move. At night, I sometimes startle awake, drenched in icy sweat, the echo of that demented shriek still ringing in my ears. Every creak and groan of the house begets visions of deformed silhouettes crouched in the shadows. In those small hours, I lay motionless, hardly daring to breathe until dawn's first light weakens the night's grip. The few times I've tried to speak of it, to unburden my soul to those closest to me, I'm met with concerned looks and gentle suggestions to seek professional help. They mean well, but how can I make them understand the impossible reality of what I witnessed? That malformed, twisted perversion of nature that wore its wrongness like a fetid shroud. So I lock the secret away, bearing this tainted knowledge alone as penance for setting foot in unhallowed places man was never meant to tread. And always the insidious whisper at the back of my mind, that it isn't over, that my transgression and trespass will have its reckoning. I still hunt from time to time, but never alone, never without a rifle and full magazine at my side. The simple joy and solace I once took in nature's beauty is lost to me now, eaten away by the cancerous unease that metastasized from that fateful December night. Some wounds, it seems, cut so deeply that they never truly heal. Like a broken bone that aches with every change of the weather, my psyche throbs and cringes at the merest suggestion of the weird and the wild. Benign shadows become toothed maws waiting to devour, each rustle of leaves the rasp of wetted claws through brittle undergrowth. The rational part of my brain insists that if the creature wanted me dead, I would never have made it out of those woods. That thought is cold comfort against the phantasms lurking at the edges of sleep and sanity. Against the existential dread of knowing mankind shares this world with the terribly ancient and antediluvian, monstrous entities unbound by what we blithely assume to be the inviolable laws of evolution and ecology. I often wonder if it still lurks in that lightless, silent space between the trees, in those lonely leagues no human eye has witnessed. If it waits and watches with a predator's patience for the day I return one time too many. The siren song of its presence pulls at me in a way I don't fully understand and am afraid to examine too closely. A decade has passed since I bore witness to the impossible. My youth has long since fallen away, eroded by the whetstone of years and the coarse sand of unrelenting anxiety. Yet the fear remains, a constant companion that walks beside me on even the most well-lit street. I've learned to compartmentalize, to bury the gibbering madness that crouches forever at the back of my mind behind a fragile bulwark of practiced normalcy. I go to work, spend time with loved ones, all while knowing it to be a farcical veneer painted over the cracked and pitted bedrock of my mind. The events of that long-ago December should have faded, blunted by the passage of time like any other traumatic memory. Instead, they retain a hyper-real clarity, as if the images were seared into my brain by the caustic venom of the unnameable. I need only close my eyes to put myself back in that place, helpless and small before the towering embodiment of wrongness. Some nights, when the wind moans its eldritch lament through the eaves and the darkness presses close against the window panes, I catch a glimpse of sallow eyes, a flash of antlers in the groaning wood at the property's edge. In those moments, the full weight of despair crashes over me, a smothering riptide dragging me into the cyclopean depths of madness. In a twist of cosmic irony, the very wilds that once brought me such solace have become a source of unending dread. A Lovecraftian nightmare made manifest that haunts the liminal space between worlds. The price of this forbidden knowledge, of gazing upon the face of the abyss and feeling its fathomless hunger gaze back, is one I will carry for the rest of my days. The most I can hope for is that when my time comes, and I am laid to rest beneath that same ancient loam, it is oblivion that greets me, and not the soul-rending horror risen from the darkly beating heart of the forest primeval to claim its long-withheld due. As I zipped up my backpack and took one last look around my small apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was forgetting something important. It was June 15th, 2022, and I, James Miller, a fresh-faced 22-year-old college graduate, was about to embark on a solo backpacking trip through the dense wilderness of northern Michigan's Hiawatha National Forest. The idea had come to me during my final exams. Stressed and overwhelmed by the looming specter of post-graduation job hunting, I yearned for an escape. A week alone in nature seemed like the perfect way to clear my head and reset before diving into the next chapter of my life. Growing up in the suburbs of Chicago, I wasn't exactly an experienced outdoorsman, but I'd been camping a handful of times as a kid and figured I could handle a week-long trek through the forest. Looking back, I can't help but cringe at my naivety. I was woefully underprepared for the challenges that lay ahead, both physically and mentally. But as I locked my apartment door and hefted my new top-of-the-line backpack onto my shoulders, all I felt was excitement and a sense of adventure. The drive up to Michigan was uneventful. I arrived at the forest's main entrance around midday, parked my car in the designated long-term lot, and double-checked my gear one last time. I had a tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, water filtration system, first aid kit, and enough dehydrated meals and trail mix to last me the week. My phone was fully charged, though I knew reception would be spotty at best once I got deep into the forest. I'd also packed a physical map and compass, feeling a bit like an old-school explorer as I tucked them into my pocket. As I signed in at the ranger station and went over my planned route with the park ranger on duty, I couldn't help but notice a slight frown cross his weathered face. "That's quite an ambitious route for a solo hiker," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes scrutinizing me. "You sure you're up for it?" I puffed out my chest a bit, feeling defensive. "I've done my research," I assured him. "I'm in good shape and I've got all the necessary gear." The ranger nodded slowly, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. "All right then, just make sure you stick to your route and check in at the designated points. If we don't hear from you, we'll send out a search party." I nodded, trying to project confidence I didn't entirely feel. With one last look at the comfort and safety of civilization, I shouldered my pack and set off down the trailhead. The first few hours were exhilarating. The June air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and earth. Sunlight filtered through the canopy above, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. Birds called to each other in the branches overhead, and occasionally I'd spot a squirrel or chipmunk darting across my path. I made good time, covering about 5 miles before I decided to make camp for the night. As I set up my tent in a small clearing, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what I'd come for: the solitude, the connection with nature, the sense of self-reliance. As darkness fell, I heated up one of my dehydrated meals on my portable stove and sat back to admire the stars peeking through the gaps in the trees above. The forest at night was alive with sound: the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I crawled into my tent feeling tired but content, looking forward to what the next day would bring. As I drifted off to sleep, I had no idea that this would be the last truly peaceful night I would experience for a long, long time. The next 2 days passed in a blur of hiking, breathtaking views, and quiet contemplation. I fell into a rhythm. Wake at dawn, break camp, hike until midday, rest and eat, then hike again until dusk. I filtered water from streams, took photos of particularly scenic spots, and reveled in the solitude. The forest seemed to welcome me, its vast expanse both humbling and invigorating. It was on the 3rd night that things began to change. I had pushed myself harder that day, eager to reach a small lake I'd marked on my map as a good campsite. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping below the tree line, painting the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. I quickly set up my tent and got a small fire going, wanting to eat and settle in before full darkness set in. As I sat by the fire, heating up a packet of dehydrated chili, I had a sudden, overwhelming sensation of being watched. It wasn't the benign feeling of being observed by curious wildlife. This was something else entirely. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my spine despite the warmth of the fire. I looked around, scanning the trees at the edge of my little clearing, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that being alone in the woods was playing tricks on my mind. But as the night wore on, the feeling only intensified. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and see nothing there. The usual nighttime chorus of crickets and frogs went quiet, replaced by an eerie stillness broken only by the occasional snapping of a twig in the dark. Each crack sent my heart racing, my imagination conjuring images of unseen predators stalking just beyond the reach of my firelight. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in my tent, every sense on high alert. More than once I jerked awake, convinced I'd heard footsteps or breathing just outside the thin fabric walls. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted and on edge, my nerves frayed from the constant state of alertness. As I emerged from my tent, I half expected to see signs of some nocturnal visitor, tracks in the dirt, claw marks on trees. But there was nothing. The clearing looked exactly as it had the night before, peaceful in the early morning light. Part of me wanted to pack up and hightail it back to civilization, to chalk the whole thing up as a failed experiment in solo wilderness adventure. But a larger part of me was determined to see this through. I'd come out here for a challenge, after all. So I forced down some breakfast, shouldered my pack and pressed on, trying to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. As I hiked that day, I couldn't help but notice subtle changes in the forest around me. The trees seemed denser, their trunks gnarled and twisted in ways I hadn't noticed before. The shadows appeared deeper, more menacing. Even the birds' song seemed different, less melodic, more discordant. I found myself checking my map and compass more frequently, only to discover that I didn't seem to be making as much progress as I should. Landmarks I was looking for never materialized, and the terrain didn't quite match what was indicated on my map. It was as if the landscape itself was subtly shifting around me, defying my attempts to navigate it. As the day wore on, my unease grew. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, startling at every rustle in the underbrush. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming just days before, now felt oppressive and alien. By the time I made camp that night, I was jumpy and paranoid. I chose a spot with my back to a large boulder, hoping it would provide some sense of security. As I set up my tent with shaking hands, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed from all sides, unseen eyes boring into me from the deepening shadows. That night, as I huddled in my sleeping bag, I heard it for the first time, a sound that would haunt my dreams for years to come. It started as a low, barely audible hum, almost below the threshold of hearing. But slowly, it grew louder, resolving into a high-pitched, insectile chittering that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Underneath this alien sound was a deeper, more ominous noise, a rhythmic thumping, like massive footsteps drawing ever closer. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the sounds grew louder and then, abruptly, stopped. The silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying. I didn't sleep at all that night. As the first light of dawn filtered through my tent, I made a decision. Map be damned. I was getting out of this forest as fast as I could. As I broke camp that morning, my hands trembling and my nerves shot, I tried to orient myself using my map and compass. To my growing horror, I realized that nothing around me matched what should have been there. The boulder I'd camped against was gone, replaced by a stand of gnarled, ancient-looking trees that I was certain hadn't been there the night before. I spun in a circle, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The forest looked wrong. The trees were too close together, their bark blackened and twisted. The ground beneath my feet felt spongy and uneven, nothing like the firm forest floor I'd been hiking on for days. Panic rising in my throat, I picked a direction at random and started walking, then running. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, my backpack snagging on low-hanging limbs. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, finally collapsing in a heap on the forest floor. As I lay there gasping for breath, I became aware of how quiet it was. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through leaves. The silence was absolute and terrifying. I forced myself to sit up, trying to get my bearings. The canopy above was so thick that little sunlight penetrated, leaving everything in a perpetual twilight. I couldn't even tell what time of day it was anymore. I reached for my water bottle only to find it nearly empty. My food supplies were running low as well. With a sinking feeling, I realized I had no idea how long I'd been out here anymore. Days? Weeks? Time seemed to have lost all meaning in this twisted version of the forest. As I sat there, trying to calm my racing thoughts and figure out what to do next, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of my vision, partially obscured by a gnarled tree trunk, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet or more, and it was thin, like a shadow given 3-dimensional form. I blinked hard, certain I was hallucinating from stress and dehydration. But when I opened my eyes, the figure was still there. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just watched. I don't know how I knew that, since I couldn't make out any distinct features, but I swear I felt its gaze boring into me. My heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I slowly got to my feet. The figure remained motionless. I took a step back, then another. It didn't react. As soon as I reached the tree line, I turned and ran again, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or stealth. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. As I leaned against a tree, fighting to catch my breath, I realized with growing dread that night was falling again. The already dim forest was growing darker by the minute, shadows deepening and merging until it was hard to tell where one tree ended and another began. I knew I should try to make camp, to conserve my energy, and try to think rationally about my situation. But I was beyond rational thought at that point. The forest around me no longer felt like a natural place. It felt alive in a malevolent way, as if the very trees and shadows were conspiring against me. As full darkness descended, I huddled at the base of a large tree, my back pressed against its trunk in a futile attempt to guard against unseen threats. I don't know how long I sat there, shivering despite the warm June air, jumping at every sound real or imagined. And then I saw them. Tiny points of bluish-white light weaving between the trees in the distance. They moved like fireflies, but with purpose, as if on a mission. Despite every instinct screaming at me to run the other way, I found myself drawn towards them. As I got closer, I realized the lights were coming from small, ethereal figures flitting through the air. They seemed to take notice of me, circling around in intricate patterns, and then, unbelievably, they began to form a path through the woods. Some part of me knew I shouldn't follow, that this could only lead to more danger. But I was beyond logical decision-making at that point. Pushed by equal parts curiosity and desperation, I stumbled after the lights, drawn deeper into the heart of the twisted forest. The ethereal lights led me through a maze of gnarled trees and dense underbrush, their soft glow the only illumination in the oppressive darkness. I lost all sense of time and direction as I followed, my mind a fog of exhaustion and fear. The forest around me seemed to shift and change with each step, the trees growing more twisted and alien. After what felt like hours of stumbling through the night, I emerged into a large clearing. The sudden openness was almost as disorienting as the dense forest had been. As my eyes adjusted, I realized with growing horror that this was no ordinary meadow. The trees surrounding the clearing were massive, their trunks wider than any I'd ever seen. But it wasn't their size that made my blood run cold. It was what was carved into them. Each tree bore intricate symbols, etched deep into the bark. They weren't like any language or writing system I recognized. The symbols seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, as if alive. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of rough-hewn stone pillars, each about 10 feet tall. They were covered in the same bizarre symbols as the trees. As I approached, drawn by a morbid curiosity I couldn't explain, I noticed dark stains on the ground around the base of each pillar. With a jolt of revulsion, I realized it was dried blood. The air in the clearing felt heavy and charged, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. There was a low, almost subsonic hum that I felt more than heard, vibrating in my bones. The ethereal lights that had led me here were gone, leaving me alone in this nightmarish place. I knew I should run to get as far away from this clearing as possible, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if the very air was holding me in place. With trembling fingers, I reached out to touch one of the symbols carved into the nearest pillar. The moment my skin made contact with the rough stone, the world seemed to shift. Colors inverted, sound muted, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I felt as if I was being turned inside out. When reality snapped back into focus, I was on my knees, gasping for air. As I struggled to my feet, I became aware of movement at the edge of the clearing. Dark shapes were emerging from between the trees, tall and impossibly thin, just like the figure I'd seen earlier. They moved with an unnatural grace, gliding rather than walking. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, forced to watch as the entities entered the stone circle. As they drew closer, I could make out more details, though my mind recoiled from what I was seeing. Their bodies were like living shadows, constantly shifting and reforming. Where faces should have been, there were only swirling voids that hurt to look at directly. Long, spindly limbs ended in wickedly sharp claws that scraped against the stone pillars as they passed. The entities began to move in a complex pattern around the circle, their movements perfectly synchronized. As they did, the symbols on the pillars began to glow with an eerie, pulsing light. The humming in the air intensified, building to a painful crescendo. I wanted to cover my ears, to close my eyes, to wake up from this nightmare. But I could only stand there, a horrified witness to whatever arcane ritual was unfolding before me. As the entities completed their circuit of the stone circle, they stopped and turned as one to face me. I felt the weight of their alien gazes, my mind threatening to shatter under the pressure of their scrutiny. And then, mercifully, everything went black. I awoke with a start, my heart pounding and my clothes soaked with sweat. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was, or how I'd gotten there. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized I was lying on the forest floor, surrounded by normal-looking trees. Gone were the twisted, alien-looking plants and the oppressive atmosphere. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, familiar and somehow comforting after the horrors I'd experienced. Birdsong filled the air, a chorus of natural sounds that felt almost miraculous after the eerie silence of the twisted forest. I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body aching as if I'd run a marathon. My mind reeled as I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a vivid nightmare? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation? But the dirt caked under my fingernails, the scratches on my arms from branches, and the lingering sense of dread in the pit of my stomach told me it had been all too real. I checked my watch only to find it had stopped. My phone was dead. I had no idea how much time had passed since I'd entered that clearing with the stone pillars. The sun was high in the sky, filtering through the canopy above, suggesting it was around midday. As I took stock of my situation, I realized my backpack was gone. With it, I'd lost most of my supplies, my tent, sleeping bag, and what remained of my food and water. All I had left were the clothes on my back and the few items in my pockets. A small pocket knife, a lighter, and my now useless compass. I stood on shaky legs, trying to orient myself. Nothing looked familiar. The forest around me was beautiful in its normalcy, but I had no idea where I was in relation to my planned route or the nightmare landscape I'd just escaped from. In the distance, I heard a sound that made my heart leap, the faint rumble of a vehicle. Civilization. Without a second thought, I started moving towards the noise, pushing through underbrush and clambering over fallen logs. As I walked, the events of the past few days, weeks, played over and over in my mind. The watching presence in the forest, the twisted landscape, the clearing with its blood-stained pillars and shadow creatures. It all seemed impossible in the light of day. Yet the fear lingered, raw and visceral. After what felt like hours of walking, I emerged from the tree line onto the shoulder of a paved road. The sight of it, this mundane strip of asphalt, nearly brought me to tears. I turned and looked at the forest behind me. From here, it looked peaceful, inviting even. But I knew better now. I started walking along the road, hoping to flag down a passing car or find a sign that could tell me where I was. As I walked, I tried to come up with a plausible explanation for my appearance and situation. Who would believe the truth? It wasn't long before I heard a vehicle approaching. I turned and waved frantically, probably looking like a madman. The pickup truck slowed and stopped beside me, an older man peering out the driver's side window with concern. "You all right, son?" he asked, taking in my disheveled appearance. I opened my mouth to respond and found I didn't know what to say. How could I possibly explain? In the end, I settled for a simplified version of the truth. "I got lost hiking," I said, my voice hoarse from disuse. "Can you tell me where I am?" The man's brow furrowed. "You're about 20 miles outside of Munising," he said. "Where were you supposed to be?" I felt the blood drain from my face. Munising was hundreds of miles from where I'd started my hike. It wasn't even in the same forest. How was this possible? The man must have seen the shock on my face because his expression softened. "Why don't you hop in?" he offered. "We can get you to town, maybe call someone for you." Gratefully, I climbed into the passenger seat. As we drove towards town, the man, who introduced himself as Bill, asked me questions about my hike and what had happened. I gave vague answers, still unsure of what to say or how to explain my impossible journey. When we reached Munising, Bill took me to the local police station. The officers there were kind but skeptical of my story. They took my information and helped me contact my parents, who were hysterical with relief and worry. It turned out I had been missing for over 2 weeks. Search parties had combed the area where I was supposed to be hiking but found no trace of me. My disappearance had made local news, with some speculating I had gotten lost and died in the wilderness. In the days that followed, as I was reunited with my family and underwent medical checks, I tried to piece together what had happened. But there were no answers to be found. The official report chalked it up to me getting lost and wandering in a delusional state before finding my way back to civilization. But I knew the truth, even if I couldn't explain it. Something had happened in those woods, something beyond the realm of normal understanding. The memories of the twisted forest, the watching presence, and the clearing with its otherworldly inhabitants haunted my dreams. I've since gone hiking again, unable to completely give up my love for nature. But I don't go alone anymore, and I never venture too deep into the wilderness, because now I know that there are things lurking in the dark corners of the world, things that defy explanation and challenge our understanding of reality. And sometimes, when I'm in the woods, I still get that feeling of being watched. I catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, gone when I turn to look. And I wonder if it's just my imagination, a leftover from my traumatic experience, or if something followed me out of that twisted forest, waiting for the right moment to pull me back into its impossible realm. In the months following my return to civilization, I struggled to readjust to normal life. The world I had known before my ill-fated hiking trip seemed somehow less real than the horrors I had experienced in the forest. I went through the motions of daily life, applying for jobs, reconnecting with friends, but I felt disconnected, as if part of me was still lost in those woods. My parents, worried about my mental state, convinced me to see a therapist. Dr. Evelyn Carter was kind and patient, but I could tell she didn't believe my story. How could she? I barely believed it myself some days. She diagnosed me with PTSD and suggested that my mind had created elaborate hallucinations to cope with the trauma of being lost in the wilderness. But I knew better. The memories were too vivid, too consistent to be mere hallucinations. The feeling of being watched, the twisted landscape, the clearing with its stone pillars and shadow creatures. These weren't figments of my imagination. They were real, even if I couldn't explain how or why. I tried to move on with my life. I got a job at a local marketing firm, rented a small apartment, and even started dating again. But the experiences in the forest had changed me fundamentally. I found myself jumping at shadows, unable to shake the feeling that something was always just out of sight, watching and waiting. It was about 6 months after my return when the dreams started. At first, they were vague and disjointed, flashes of dark trees, the sound of that insectile chittering, glimpses of tall, shadowy figures. But as time went on, they became more vivid and coherent. In these dreams, I would find myself back in that clearing with the stone pillars. The shadow creatures would be there, moving in their eerie, synchronized dance. But now, instead of being a passive observer, I was part of the ritual. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The symbols from the pillars burned into my mind's eye. I started researching, spending hours online and in libraries, looking for any information about similar experiences or unexplained phenomena in the Hiawatha National Forest. Most of what I found was typical cryptozoology and UFO conspiracy theories, nothing that matched what I had seen and experienced. But then, buried in an obscure forum thread, I found a post that made my blood run cold. A hiker described getting lost in the Hiawatha forest and stumbling upon a clearing with stone pillars covered in strange symbols. The post was several years old, and the user hadn't been active since making it. But the details matched my experience too closely to be coincidence. I reached out to the poster, sending a private message explaining my own experience and asking for more information. Weeks passed with no response. I was beginning to think it was a dead end when I finally received a reply. The message was brief and cryptic. "They're still watching. Be careful. Don't go back into the woods alone." That night, my dreams were more intense than ever. I was back in the clearing, but this time, the shadow creatures were reaching for me with their long, spindly arms. I could feel their cold touch on my skin, hear their alien thoughts scratching at the edges of my consciousness. I woke up screaming, my roommate pounding on my door to check if I was okay. The next day, still shaken from the nightmare, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. Without really thinking about it, I found myself at the edge of a small wooded area near my apartment. It was nothing like the vast wilderness of Hiawatha, just a small urban park, really. But as I stood there looking at the trees, I felt that familiar prickle of being watched. Against my better judgment, I stepped into the woods. The sounds of the city faded away, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the crunch of twigs under my feet. As I walked deeper into the trees, the light seemed to dim, the shadows growing longer and darker. And then I saw it. A flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. But the feeling of being watched intensified, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I turned to leave, to get out of the woods as fast as I could, but I couldn't remember which way I had come from. Panic started to set in as I realized the trees around me looked different, older and more gnarled than they should be. The air felt heavier, charged with that same electric energy I had felt in the clearing with the stone pillars. As I stood there, frozen in fear and indecision, I heard it. that high-pitched, insectile chittering that had haunted my dreams for months. It was distant at first, but growing louder, coming from all directions at once. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning with each desperate breath. I ran until I burst out of the trees onto a busy street, nearly getting hit by a car in the process. As I stood there on the sidewalk, gasping for air and ignoring the strange looks from passers-by, I looked back at the woods. From here, they looked normal, just a small, harmless patch of urban greenery. But I knew better now. Whatever I had encountered in the Hiawatha National Forest hadn't stayed there. It had followed me. Or perhaps it had always been everywhere, hiding just out of sight in every shadow, every dark corner of the world. And now that I had seen it, now that I knew it was there, it would never leave me alone. I walked home in a daze, my mind reeling. I knew then that I could never fully escape what had happened to me in those woods. The experience had changed me, opened my eyes to a reality that most people never see or even suspect exists. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I made a decision. I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. I couldn't go back to my old life, ignoring the shadows at the edge of my vision. If this thing, whatever it was going to haunt me, then I was going to face it head on. I was going to find out what it was, why it had chosen me, and if there was any way to stop it. In the weeks that followed my encounter in the urban park, I threw myself into researching anything and everything that might explain what I had experienced. I pored over books on folklore and mythology, delved into obscure corners of the internet, and even reached out to experts in fields ranging from psychology to theoretical physics. Most of what I found was useless, either too fantastical to be believable or too mundane to explain the impossible things I had seen. But slowly, piece by piece, I began to build a theory. There were stories scattered across cultures and throughout history of places where the veil between worlds was thin, places where reality seemed to bend and break, where things from elsewhere could slip through. The details varied, but the core idea was the same. Our world wasn't as solid or as singular as we like to believe. The more I researched, the more I became convinced that I had stumbled into one of these places in the Hiawatha National Forest. But that didn't explain why I had been chosen, or why the experience seemed to be following me. I needed more information, and I knew I wouldn't find it in books or on the internet. I needed to talk to someone who had been through something similar. I remembered the forum post I had found months ago, the hiker who had described a clearing with stone pillars. I sent another message to the poster, more urgent this time. To my surprise, I received a reply almost immediately. It was just an address and a time, nothing more. But it was something. The address led me to a small cafe on the outskirts of town. As I pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling softly, I scanned the nearly empty room. In a corner booth, hunched over a cup of coffee, sat a man who looked to be in his 50s. His hair was graying at the temples, and deep lines etched his face. When he looked up and met my eyes, I saw a haunted look I recognized all too well. I slid into the booth across from him, and for a long moment, we just stared at each other in silence. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "So, you've seen them too." It wasn't a question. I nodded, relief washing over me at finally being able to talk to someone who understood. The man introduced himself as Michael. Over the next few hours, he told me his story. It was eerily similar to mine. A solo hiking trip, getting lost in a forest that seemed to defy the laws of nature, encountering the shadow creatures in a clearing with stone pillars. But Michael's story didn't end there. In the years since his experience, he had dedicated his life to understanding what had happened to him. He had traveled the world, seeking out others who had similar encounters, piecing together a picture of something vast and terrifying. "They're not from here," Michael said, his eyes darting around the cafe as if expecting to see one of the creatures materialize at any moment. "Not just not from this forest or this country. They're not from this world, this reality." He went on to explain his theory. The creatures we had encountered were from some other plane of existence, one that occasionally intersected with our own. The clearings with the stone pillars were nexus points, places where the barrier between realities was weakest. But why us? I asked, voicing the question that had been gnawing at me for months. Why were we chosen? Michael shook his head. I don't think we were chosen, not really. I think we were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe the right place at the right time, depending on how you look at it. We saw behind the curtain, and now we can't unsee it. As our conversation wound down, Michael reached into his bag and pulled out a small leather-bound book. He slid it across the table to me. This is everything I've learned, he said. Names, dates, locations. Other people who've had similar experiences. Maybe you can make more sense of it than I have. I took the book, feeling its weight in my hands. It felt like more than just paper and leather. It felt like a key to understanding the impossible things I had seen and experienced. As I stood to leave, Michael grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. Be careful, he said, his eyes intense. They know we've seen them, and they don't like being seen. I left the cafe with my head spinning, clutching Michael's book like a lifeline. I had come looking for answers, but I had only found more questions. But for the first time since my experience in the forest, I felt like I had a purpose, a direction. I spent the next few weeks poring over Michael's book, cross-referencing his notes with my own research. A pattern began to emerge, a network of locations around the world where similar phenomena had been reported. The Hiawatha National Forest was just one node in a vast, invisible web. But as I delved deeper into this hidden world, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched more closely than ever. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and I often caught glimpses of movement just at the edge of my vision. One night, as I sat at my desk surrounded by papers and open books, I heard that now familiar chittering sound. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned to look at my window. There, pressed against the glass, was a dark, spindly hand, its long fingers splayed out as if reaching for me. I blinked, and it was gone. But I knew what I had seen. They had found me. And they were getting closer. After seeing the shadow creature's hand on his window, James decides he must confront the entities directly. He plans a return trip to the Hiawatha National Forest, this time prepared with knowledge from Michael's book and his own research. James hikes deep into the forest, intentionally seeking out the otherworldly presence he once fled from. He finds the clearing with the stone pillars again, and performs a ritual described in Michael's notes to summon the shadow creatures. The entities appear, more terrifying than ever. James demands answers, asking why they've been haunting him. The creatures communicate telepathically, revealing that James's initial encounter accidentally linked him to their realm. They've been drawn to his awareness of them ever since. James realizes the only way to sever this connection is to undergo a dangerous ritual that will erase his memories of the entities. With great reluctance, he agrees. The story ends with James waking up in a hospital, having been found wandering the forest with no memory of the past few months. He's told he got lost while hiking, but feels an inexplicable sense of unease around shadows and dense forests. The final scene shows James back in his normal life, but occasionally catching glimpses of something just out of sight, hinting that while his conscious memories are gone, some part of him still remembers the truth about what lurks in the shadows. I was born and raised in the state of Maine, and I am of Penobscot and Abenaki descent. Growing up, I heard countless legends passed down through generations, tales that both fascinated and chilled me to the bone. But there was one story that always stood out, a warning that echoed in my mind long after the embers of the campfire had died out. It was the story of the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit that haunted the forests, feeding on the flesh of the living. The story I'm about to tell you took place in the winter of 2019, when I was a 20-year-old college student in the town of Farmington, Maine. The campus was nestled along the banks of the Sandy River, a winding tributary that carved its way through the dense pine forests of the region. My friends and I would often venture down to the river's edge to escape the monotony of our studies, seeking solace in the crisp, clean air and the tranquil beauty of nature. One particularly cold evening, we decided to build a campfire by the river, hoping to ward off the biting chill that had settled over the land. I volunteered to gather kindling, making my way down to the laundry room to collect lint from the dryers. The snow had fallen heavily in the days prior, and I knew that most of the branches and twigs in the woods would be too damp to ignite easily. As I made my way back to the overlook where we had agreed to meet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The moment I stepped onto the frozen sand, a sense of unease washed over me, as though unseen eyes were watching my every move. I tried to brush off the feeling, attributing it to the eerie stillness of the winter night. But deep down, I knew better than to ignore my instincts. My friends had already begun to gather firewood, their laughter and chatter carrying across the river. I knelt down beside the ring of stones we had used countless times before, focusing my attention on the task at hand. As I worked to coax a flame from the lint, a sudden sound from the beach below caught my attention. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunched through the snow, echoing in the silence of the night. I glanced up, scanning the shoreline for any sign of movement. "Did you hear that?" I asked Ian, one of my closest friends who was standing nearby. He looked at me, confusion etched across his face as he shook his head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone, that something dark and sinister lurked just beyond the reach of the firelight. And then, the smell hit me. It was a sickly sweet odor, like the stench of rotting fruit mingled with the unmistakable scent of death. I recoiled, my stomach churning as I fought the urge to gag. I looked around at my friends, searching their faces for any indication that they had noticed the foul stench. But they seemed oblivious, lost in their own conversations. Just as I was about to speak, a voice called out my name, a sound that sent chills racing down my spine. It was a guttural, inhuman sound, like the crackling of radio static mixed with the grating of metal against metal. In that moment, the pieces fell into place, and a wave of terror washed over me. The uneasy feeling of being watched, the heavy footsteps, the rotten stench, and now, the voice calling my name. I had heard the stories of the Wendigo all my life, whispered warnings passed down from my grandfather. But until that moment, I had never truly believed them. Now, faced with the undeniable truth, I felt my blood run cold. Instinctively, I pressed my face into the snow, squeezing my eyes shut as if by doing so, I could will the creature away. My heart raced in my chest, pounding against my ribs like a caged animal desperate to escape. I could hear my friends' voices, distant and muffled, as they called out to me, but I dared not respond, fearing that any sound I made would draw the Wendigo's attention. The voice called out again, this time sounding eerily familiar, like an echo of my grandfather's warnings. But I knew better than to be fooled by its deception. The Wendigo was a master of mimicry, luring its victims with the voices of loved ones, only to consume them whole, leaving nothing but bones picked clean in the snow. I lay there, motionless, barely daring to breathe, as the footsteps drew closer, the stench of decay growing stronger with each passing second. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, and for a moment, I was certain that the creature would find me, that it would sink its teeth into my flesh and devour me alive. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence vanished. The footsteps receded, fading into the distance, and the nauseating smell dissipated, carried away on the winter wind. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, my face buried in the snow, until the sound of my friends' voices finally broke through the fog of terror that had enveloped me. Slowly, cautiously, I sat up, keeping my eyes fixed on the ground as I scanned my surroundings. My friends had gathered around me, their faces etched with worry and confusion. They bombarded me with questions, asking if I was all right, what had happened, but I couldn't find the words to explain the horror I had just experienced. I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaking beneath me, and mumbled something about feeling ill. My friends, bless their hearts, didn't press the issue, instead offering to help me back to the dorms. We walked in silence, the only sound the crunching of our footsteps in the snow and the distant rushing of the river. Once we were safely inside, Ian pulled me aside, his eyes searching mine for answers. I hesitated, torn between the desire to confide in my friend and the fear that speaking of the Wendigo would somehow summon it back. In the end, I settled for a half-truth, telling him that I had felt like something was watching us, that I had been gripped by a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread. Ian seemed to accept my explanation, though the concern never quite left his eyes. As we parted ways for the night, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt for not being fully honest with him. But deep down, I knew that the truth was too terrifying, too unbelievable, to share. It wasn't until years later, after I had moved away from Farmington, that I finally found the courage to speak of my encounter. Even then, I was careful to choose my confidants wisely, sharing my story only with those I trusted implicitly. To my surprise, none of my friends had heard or smelled anything unusual that night, leading me to believe that the Wendigo had singled me out, perhaps sensing the knowledge of its existence that lay dormant within me. In the weeks and months that followed, I found myself haunted by the memory of that night by the river. Sleep became a rare and precious commodity, as every time I closed my eyes, I was transported back to that frozen beach, the stench of death filling my nostrils and the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. I threw myself into my studies, desperate for any distraction from the gnawing fear that had taken root in my mind. But even the bustle of campus life and the demands of my coursework couldn't entirely banish the specter of the Wendigo. It lurked at the edges of my consciousness, a constant reminder of the darkness that lay hidden beneath the veneer of the world I thought I knew. As the winter gave way to spring and the snow began to melt from the banks of the sandy river, I found myself increasingly drawn back to the place where I had encountered the creature. It was as if some invisible force was pulling me, urging me to confront the terror that had gripped me that night. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows began to lengthen, I made my way down to the river's edge, my heart pounding in my chest. The overlook was deserted, the ring of stones that had once housed our campfires now cold and lifeless. I stood there, staring out across the water, half expecting to hear the sound of heavy footsteps or catch a whiff of that sickening, sweet stench. But the only sound was the gentle rustling of the pines and the distant cry of a loon echoing across the darkening sky. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath of the crisp, clean air, and for a moment I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Perhaps, I thought, the Wendigo had been nothing more than a figment of my imagination, a manifestation of the fears and anxieties that had plagued me for so long. Just as I was about to turn back, a sudden gust of wind whipped through the trees, sending a shower of pine needles cascading down around me. And then I heard it, a whisper, barely audible above the rustling of the branches, but unmistakable in its malevolence. "I see you," the voice hissed, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "You cannot escape me." I spun around, my eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Only the lengthening shadows and the growing darkness, pressing in around me like a physical force. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the damp sand, and then I was running, tearing through the underbrush, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my dorm room, slamming the door behind me and collapsing onto my bed, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It was then, as I lay there trembling, that I realized the truth. The Wendigo was no mere legend, no fairy tale monster conjured up to frighten children. It was real, and it had marked me as its prey. From that moment on, I lived in a constant state of fear, always looking over my shoulder, always listening for the sound of footsteps or the whisper of that terrible voice. I withdrew from my friends, spending more and more time alone in my room, poring over ancient texts and faded photographs, searching for any scrap of information that might help me understand the creature that stalked me. I learned that the Wendigo was a creature of hunger, a spirit that was never satisfied, always craving more. It was said to possess the bodies of those who succumbed to cannibalism, transforming them into gaunt, emaciated creatures with hearts of ice and an insatiable appetite for human flesh. But there were also stories of those who had managed to escape the Wendigo's clutches, who had found ways to ward off its evil influence. Some spoke of protective charms and amulets, others of sacred rituals and incantations passed down through generations. I became obsessed with these tales, spending long hours in the library, scouring dusty tomes and faded manuscripts for any scrap of knowledge that might aid me in my fight against the creature. I even reached out to my grandfather, hoping that he might have some insight into the legends of our people. But when I finally managed to get in touch with him, my grandfather's response was not what I had hoped for. He listened patiently as I recounted my tale, his weathered face growing more and more somber with each passing minute. When I had finished, he was silent for a long time, staring off into the distance as if seeing something that I could not. "You must be very careful," he said at last, his voice heavy with concern. "The Wendigo is a powerful spirit, and it has marked you as its own. It will not rest until it has claimed you, body and soul." I felt a chill run down my spine at his words, a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. "But there must be something I can do," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "Some way to protect myself, to fight back against it." My grandfather shook his head sadly. "There is no fighting the Wendigo," he said. "Once it has chosen you, there is no escape. The only thing you can do is to keep moving, to stay one step ahead of it, and pray that it loses interest in you." I left my grandfather's house feeling more lost and alone than ever before. The weight of his words hung heavy on my shoulders, a constant reminder of the fate that awaited me. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm me, I knew that I could not give up. I had to keep searching, keep fighting, no matter the cost. And so I threw myself into my research with renewed fervor, spending every waking moment scouring the internet and the library for any scrap of information that might aid me in my fight. I talked to shamans and medicine men, seeking their wisdom and guidance, and I even began to experiment with some of the protective charms and amulets I had read about. But always, in the back of my mind, lurked the knowledge that the Wendigo was still out there, waiting for me. I could feel its presence, like a dark shadow hovering just beyond the edge of my vision, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before it made its move. As the weeks turned into months, and the seasons changed from spring to summer, I found myself growing more and more isolated from the world around me. My grades began to slip, and my professors started to express concern about my well-being, but I couldn't bring myself to care. All that mattered was staying one step ahead of the Wendigo, of finding some way to break free from its grip. I started to have vivid, terrifying dreams, nightmares in which I found myself lost in a dark, twisted forest, the trees closing in around me like grasping hands. In these dreams, I could hear the Wendigo's voice, whispering to me from the shadows, promising me power and immortality if only I would submit to its will. But even in my dreams, I fought back, clinging to the shreds of my sanity with all the strength I could muster. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, and I knew that I could not let the creature win. As the summer wore on, I started to notice strange things happening around me. Objects would go missing from my room, only to reappear in odd places, as if someone had been moving them while I slept. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that seemed to flicker and dance in the periphery of my vision. And then, one sweltering August night, I woke to the sound of something scratching at my window. At first, I thought it was just a branch blown by the wind. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the steady rhythmic scraping, I felt a cold dread settle over me. I forced myself to sit up, my heart pounding in my ears, and peered out into the night. At first, I saw nothing but the inky blackness of the forest, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the edge of the tree line. It was facing away from me, but even from this distance, I could see the unnatural thinness of its limbs, the way its skin seemed to stretch tight over its bones. And then slowly, it turned its head, and I saw its face. It was a nightmare made flesh, a twisted, distorted parody of a human being. Its eyes were sunken and hollow, glittering with a feral, hungry light, and its mouth was a gaping maw, filled with jagged, yellowed teeth. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat, and all that came out was a strangled, choking sound. The creature took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, and I could see the hunger in its eyes, the raw, primal need that drove it. I fumbled for the charm I kept by my bedside, a small carved figure that my grandfather had given me, said to ward off evil spirits. But as my fingers closed around it, I felt a searing pain shoot through my hand, and I dropped it with a cry. The Wendigo was closer now, almost to the window, and I could smell the stench of decay that clung to it, the sickly, sweet odor of rotting flesh. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable, for the feel of those jagged teeth sinking into my flesh. But the blow never came. Instead, I heard a sudden, piercing shriek, a sound that sent chills racing down my spine. My eyes flew open, and I saw the creature stumbling backward, clutching at its face as if in pain. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the shadows of the forest, leaving me alone and trembling in the darkness. The next morning, I woke to find the charm my grandfather had given me lying on the floor beside my bed, the wood scorched and blackened as if it had been held in a flame. I picked it up gingerly, turning it over in my hands, and saw that the carved symbols that had once adorned its surface were now barely visible, obscured by the charring. I knew then that I could not stay in Farmington any longer. The Wendigo had found me, and it would not rest until it had claimed me as its own. I had to get away, to put as much distance between myself and the creature as possible. I spent the next few days in a frenzy of activity, packing my belongings and making arrangements to transfer to a new school. I told no one of my plans, not even my closest friends, for fear that the Wendigo might somehow use them to get to me. On the day of my departure, I woke before dawn, my heart heavy with the knowledge of what I was leaving behind. I took one last look around my dorm room, at the posters on the walls and the books scattered across my desk, and felt a pang of regret for the life I was leaving behind. But I knew that I had no choice. The Wendigo had marked me, and I could not rest until I had found a way to break free from its grasp. And so, with a heavy heart, I shouldered my backpack and set out into the gray, misty morning. As I walked through the quiet streets of Farmington, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking threat, every rustling leaf a sign of the creature's presence. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting from side to side, my hand clutching the charm in my pocket like a lifeline. I made it to the bus station just as the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a pale, watery light over the town. I bought a ticket for the first bus out of Farmington, not caring where it was going, only that it would take me far away from this place and the horrors that lurked within it. As I sat on the bus, watching the familiar streets and buildings of Farmington recede into the distance, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I had escaped, at least for now. But even as I allowed myself to relax, I knew that my ordeal was far from over. The Wendigo was still out there, and it would not rest until it had found me again. The years that followed were a blur of constant movement and fear. I drifted from town to town, never staying in one place for more than a few months at a time. I took whatever jobs I could find, working as a dishwasher, a janitor, a factory worker, anything to keep myself moving, to stay one step ahead of the creature that haunted my dreams. But no matter how far I ran, I could never quite shake the feeling that the Wendigo was still out there, watching me from the shadows. I would catch glimpses of it in the corner of my eye, hear its whispers on the wind, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before it found me again. I tried to find solace in the old ways, in the traditions and beliefs of my ancestors. I sought out medicine men and shamans, hoping that they might have some insight into the creature that stalked me. But even they seemed powerless in the face of the Wendigo's hunger, and I soon lost faith in their ability to help me. And then, one cold, gray morning, I woke to find a message waiting for me. It was from my grandfather, a short, cryptic note scrawled on a piece of yellowed paper. "Come home," it said. It is time. I knew what he meant, of course. He had always said that there would come a day when I would have to face the Wendigo, to confront the creature that had marked me as its own. And now, it seemed, that day had come. I made my way back to Maine, back to the forests and rivers of my childhood. I found my grandfather waiting for me at the edge of the woods, his face lined with age and wisdom. He led me deep into the forest, to a clearing where a fire burned low and smoky. There, he told me the true story of the Wendigo, of the hunger that could never be sated, the emptiness that could never be filled. He spoke of the creature's origins, of the way it had once been human, before the hunger had taken hold and twisted it into something monstrous. And then he told me what I had to do. I had to face the Wendigo, to look into its eyes and see the emptiness there, the void that could never be filled. I had to let go of my fear, my anger, my despair, and find the strength within myself to resist its call. I listened to his words, my heart pounding in my chest, and I knew that he was right. I had been running from the Wendigo for too long, letting it consume me with fear and doubt. It was time to face it, to confront the darkness that lurked within me. And so, as the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened, I stepped out into the clearing. My grandfather's charm clutched tight in my hand. I could feel the Wendigo's presence, the weight of its hunger bearing down on me like a physical force. But I stood my ground, my eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the tree line, and I waited for it to come. The Wendigo emerged from the shadows like a nightmare made flesh, its gaunt, emaciated form moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Its eyes were hollow pits, glittering with a feral, hungry light, and its mouth was a gaping maw filled with jagged, yellowed teeth. I felt a wave of terror wash over me as it approached, my legs trembling beneath me, my heart pounding in my chest. But I forced myself to stand my ground, to look into those empty, soulless eyes and see the creature for what it truly was. And in that moment, I understood. The Wendigo was not some external force, some malevolent spirit that had chosen me as its prey. It was a part of me, a manifestation of my own fears and doubts, my own hunger and emptiness. I had spent so long running from it, trying to escape the darkness within myself, that I had never stopped to confront it head-on. But now, standing there in that clearing, with the weight of my grandfather's wisdom behind me, I knew what I had to do. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, and let go of everything that had been holding me back. I let go of my fear, my anger, my despair, and I embraced the emptiness within me, the void that could never be filled. And as I did, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, a calm that I had never known before. The Wendigo's presence seemed to fade, its hunger no longer a tangible force, and I knew that I had won. I opened my eyes and saw my grandfather standing before me, a proud smile on his weathered face. "You have done well," he said, his voice barely a whisper. You have faced your demons and emerged stronger for it. I nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over me. I knew that I still had a long way to go, that the hunger within me would never truly be gone. But I also knew that I had the strength to face it, to keep moving forward, no matter what challenges lay ahead. As I turned to leave the clearing, I paused, looking back at my grandfather one last time. Thank you, I said, my voice hoarse with emotion. For everything. He nodded, his eyes twinkling with a knowing light. Remember, he said, the Wendigo may always be with you, but it does not define you. You are stronger than your hunger, stronger than your fear. Never forget that. And with those words echoing in my mind, I stepped out of the clearing and back into the world, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The Wendigo might always be a part of me, but it would never control me again. I was free, at last, to live my life on my own terms, and to find my own way forward, no matter where the path might lead.